Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I sat on the cushioned armchair in the hotel room Jessica had rented after running off inexplicably from her shift last night. I had called her earlier this morning after finishing work without even going to sleep. She's always been level-headed, and her acting like this made me feel concerned. I couldn't just let it go, and now here I was, listening to how she apparently spoke to herself last night on the phone. "Jessica, are you sure these night shifts aren't a bit too much for you?" I asked, though I wanted to trust her. "What you're describing to me sounds straight out of a book or a movie, and the lack of sleep really takes a toll bigger than you can even comprehend. I'm not saying you're making this up, but maybe you just remembered it wrong." Jessica paced around the room with one hand resting on her hip and the other held up to her forehead, pushing her hair back, and exhaled loudly. "I know how insane this sounds, Marcus, but I'm telling you, I'm 100% certain about what I heard and saw on those cameras. There was another me in that house last night, and some person broke my damn window. How can you be taking this so calmly? We haven't even heard from the responders yet, and it's been more than 6 hours." She was right. There had been no information back to us on that call, nothing on the news, no contact from the officers. When I used Jessica's phone to try and call back whoever it was that woke her up, there was nothing. I told her that while I couldn't explain the call itself, I agreed that it was too dangerous for her to go back home, considering there was an intruder. I offered her to stay at my place for the next few days, and while she agreed and thanked me, she wouldn't let the topic of her other self go. I understood her to some extent, but I was still skeptical. So I offered her to go back to my place so I could change and grab the pistol I kept locked in my safe and a flashlight. Then we could look for the officers at her house ourselves. She was afraid, but I think the curiosity and stress about what might have happened to the supposed other her prevailed, and was what made her agree to this plan. The drive to her house wasn't long, and during it, I tried to play some music to lighten the mood or talk to her about anything so I could distract her. But all I got was 1 or 2 words in response, while she was lost in thought, looking out the window. When we arrived, I parked in her driveway where, just outside, sat the police car with the 2 front doors slightly ajar, with no sign of the officers. Jessica's breathing quickened, and I put a hand on her shoulder to calm her down. Then, without anything being said, both of us got out of the car. The first thing we did was walk up to the police car and see if there was anything out of the ordinary, like slashed tires or any signs of a struggle. But it was parked there like any other vehicle, and there was nothing obvious on the inside. What I discovered, though, was the radio, which, while it didn't look like it had been tampered with, was not working. I walked back toward the house and called for Jessica to walk with me as we circled it from a distance, finding the broken window leading into the kitchen. I was just about to suggest calling 911 again and having them go into the house while we waited outside, but Jessica snapped before I could even begin to speak. "Why the hell is nothing being done about this?" She raised her hands in the air and turned to look at me, her blue eyes conveying a mixture of anger and confusion. 2 policemen have disappeared since responding to this call. There was an intruder in my home, and there was literally a clone or something of me inside while I was at work. Tell me why we haven't heard anything about this, Marcus. I don't know, okay. If everything happened like you say it did, it just doesn't make sense. I cut her off before she started talking again, knowing that she would jump on me for accusing her of lying. But we really should just let the authorities handle this. We are not professionals. Jessica tried to get something out, but just cut herself off and shook her head. I thought she had given in and would do the logical thing and take my advice. Instead, she turned and walked a few steps toward her back door, and then looked back at me. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I'm going in. No one's going to listen to me anyway, and I'm not about to leave here without at least some kind of answer or clue," she answered. I stared at her, completely taken aback, and waited a few seconds to see if she would say anything else. But she just stayed there, looking right at me. I knew deep down she was hoping I would say that I would be going in with her. Well, before I did that, I tried to convince her to think this through again, but that was obviously not going to work. So that's just what I did, but I have to admit, I was getting nervous myself. The back door was unlocked and led into a different hallway than the one she told me about, which I figured out by the lack of an attic hatch. Jessica told me the layout of her home, and we walked together, me in front of her and my weapon drawn as I called out, asking if anyone was there. She smacked my shoulder and raised her arms with wide eyes, and I shushed her. We had no way of knowing if there was an intruder or police officers or both, and I didn't want blood on my hands, no matter whose. As you might expect, we got no response from anywhere and heard nothing that might indicate there being anyone else here with us. We found nothing out of the ordinary in the rooms of Jessica's home, but the hallway with the attic had some things worth noting. The first being what we immediately saw: the phone on the ground and slight marks like scratches on the walls, which were the only signs of anything out of the ordinary, besides the broken window. "That must be what she used to call," Jessica said, grabbing it and trying to turn it on, but it had no battery left. The screen was slightly cracked at the top right edge, probably where it first impacted the floor. "What the hell is going on, Marcus?" "Calm down," I began, knowing that she wouldn't listen to me. "There's only the attic and the basement left for us to look through. We can check up there and then go down last. How's that sound?" "Yeah, okay, but the basement's locked. If the key hasn't been moved, it must be in one of my bedroom drawers," she replied. "All right, I'll check out the attic while you grab the key. There's no point in both of us going up there." I raised my weapon into the air while reaching for my flashlight. "Don't worry about me." Jessica nodded and began walking toward the bedroom, disappearing past the door after I started ascending into the attic. There was nothing on top of the hatch, which I realized before even looking around to see, because of how easily I was able to lift it open. This confirmed our suspicions that the other woman hadn't made it up there before the end of the call. What immediately struck me as odd was the immediate drop in temperature here. Yeah, it was an attic, but the difference must have been at least 10 degrees, and I shivered as I made my way up and started shining the light across the entire space. Behind empty old boxes, worn-out furniture, and various other items not worth noting, there was no place for anyone to hide up here. I looked through every nook and cranny there was, and found no traces of anyone or anything. Walking back, I started descending the ladder and called for Jessica, but I got no response. I wasn't immediately concerned because the hatch was left open, and if anything had happened, I would have heard it. Waiting for a few seconds and remaining without a response, I made my way toward the bedroom, which was just as empty as when we looked in there together earlier. I called for her again and started looking through each of the rooms. While doing that, I paused for a moment to listen, but not for Jessica. The background noises from earlier, like birds or passing cars, had all stopped. Again, that didn't strike me as odd at that moment. Looking through the rest of the rooms proved fruitless, and I thought that maybe she had gone outside, probably waiting for me by the basement. So I made my way to the back door and opened it. It led me back into the living room. I blinked and looked behind me. I was certainly in the same corridor we were first in when entering the house. Despite that, I shut the door and turned back to exit from the front of the house. When I opened that one, I was greeted with the kitchen. I just stood there for a few seconds, unable to take in what was happening. I rubbed my eyes, but here I was, still inside the house, standing right at the front door, which was leading me back inside. I walked through and approached the window that was broken by the intruder. Instead of the green yard, the street parked with cars, and neighboring houses, I was greeted by a view into the bedroom. My heart started pounding, and I admit that I was on the verge of a panic attack. I started sweating profusely, and my heart felt like it was about to jump out of my chest as I began running from room to room, door through door, trying to get out. Again and again, I found myself in different parts of the house. I had to stop and sit down for a few moments before I passed out. While regaining my composure, I saw something odd. Not that this situation wasn't far more disturbing than I'm giving it credit for. I noticed that the walls of the living room where I was currently sitting had changed color, and half the coffee table was just missing. Like, imagine a bug or glitch in some video game where half a piece of furniture is there and the rest is gone. The table still had two of its legs on which it was standing completely fine, but the surface was cut diagonally, and the rest of it just wasn't even there. I waved my hand through where it was supposed to be, and it just swiped right through the air. I continued walking through different rooms, and the changes began getting more and more apparent. Like the chandelier in the kitchen was just upside down and sitting in the middle of the air, attached to nothing. It was physically there, and when I tried pushing it, it wouldn't move, but I could feel and touch it. I don't know how long I spent in this place, but for the first time in what was now feeling like hours, I heard a noise. Breathing. Rapid, scared breathing, just like mine when I found myself here. It was coming from the neighboring room. I couldn't say which one, as by now it had been a gamble where I'd end up. I ended up appearing back in the bedroom, where I was greeted by a gruesome sight of a tall man with torn clothing and wounds, superficial and deep, all over his body, lying in a messy pool of blood and something dark mixed with it, some of which was also splattered on the wall behind him, where I saw some scratch marks similar to the ones on the wall from the hallway earlier. It was as if I'd had an instantaneous flashback after seeing him. What remained of his clothing was the same as what the person who had broken into Jessica's home was wearing. He was still alive, but his eyes were red, and he screamed as he saw me. I did the same in reaction. No, no, no. Get away from me. Get away from me. He yelled through painful inhales, and tried to muster up strength to throw one of his shoes at me. But it only got over his leg and was barely any further away from him. "Get the hell away, I'm not going to hurt you." "Look, I started. "You're not real, not real." Taking the risk of giving him a heart attack that would finally take him out of his misery, I rushed by his side and held my hands in the air, yelling loud enough to silence him. I started shooting every question I could think of at him. When he stopped trying to talk over me, I grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him. He looked as if he was about to faint at any moment now. I asked him what this place was, why he broke in if he knew Jessica, and I could barely get any coherent response out of him until he grasped my right arm with strength he didn't look like he had, which left me shocked and silent. During my time of silence, he spoke, "Not people, fake." Before I could inquire or he could reveal more himself, I was suddenly thrown into the wall next to the man. I couldn't even yell in reaction to the pain. Another blow struck me right in the ribs, and the pain was so unexpected and strong, I held my eyes shut and clutched at my sides. Amidst the chaos, I could hear the man scream, and suddenly, what I assumed happened was that he got thrown away. His screams continued but faded in the distance, and I heard a crash and glass breaking mere moments later. Just as I was about to open my eyes, I was grabbed by one of my arms and flung right back out of the room's door. Suddenly, all the noise stopped, and I stayed curled in a ball on the floor, tears of pain streaming down my cheeks as I held my hands over where I'd been kicked or punched or whatever happened. I assumed I had at least 2 broken ribs, and I could barely touch the area without sharp pain shooting through me. When I opened my eyes, I found myself back in the attic. But this time, I could hear Jessica yelling for me downstairs. I slowly got myself back up, holding my side while descending back down into the corridor. I could hear the neighborhood sounds had returned. "I'm here," I shouted, and sat on the floor while waiting for her to arrive. When she did, she gasped and ran at me, putting a hand on my shoulder and asking me what happened and how I got hurt. "We have to get out of here," she said, helping me get up and allowing me to lean on her as we started walking out. "I'll explain at the hotel." I allowed her to drive, and she kept asking me questions in the meantime, but I was too exhausted and in pain to respond coherently. We arrived at the parking lot, and she turned to face me, looking me in the eyes and saying something I didn't even register at that point. I was too caught up in a small detail that I knew I would have noticed for all the time I'd known her. "Jessica, since when are your eyes 2 different colors?" Back in 2014, I lived in Portland, Oregon, having moved there for a fresh start and a new job opportunity. It was just me and my 5-year-old daughter Emma living in a cozy 2-story townhouse. We were still getting used to the area and hadn't made many friends yet, but we did become acquainted with the elderly gentleman who lived next door. His name was Frank, and we shared a duplex with our units connected by a thin wall. Our street was lined with beautiful cherry blossom trees, and it felt like a safe, quiet neighborhood. But Portland has these pockets where conditions can change dramatically from block to block. We lived near some rougher areas, but I felt relatively secure in our new home. I remember seeing a Facebook post a few nights before this incident. It was one of those safety tips suggesting you keep your car keys next to your bedside table. So if anything ever happened, you could press the alarm to scare off an intruder. I'm usually not one to follow random safety advice from social media, and I rarely took those tips seriously. But for some reason, this particular night, I decided to heed that advice. I was reading a novel in bed with my lamp on in my second-floor bedroom, hours after tucking Emma into her bed, when I heard a loud sound outside. I peered through the curtains to take a look, but I saw nothing unusual. I had taken some melatonin earlier that evening, so I turned off the light and settled in to sleep. Maybe 30 minutes later, I was suddenly jolted awake by what felt like an earthquake. The entire room shook, and I heard a loud thud that seemed to come from right next door. Half awake, I gasped and sat up, wondering if I had imagined it or if something had actually happened. My first instinct was to run to Emma's room, thinking she might have fallen out of her bed or hurt herself somehow. As I swung her door wide open, there she was, sleeping soundly and peacefully. I was completely confused. Then I heard another loud bang, and an eerie feeling crept over me that something was very wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. I grabbed my car key fob and took it downstairs as I nervously inspected the first floor. I promised myself that if I heard one more sound, I would press the alarm just in case. But everything fell silent after that. I returned to bed and took a while to fall asleep again. But eventually, I drifted off. The next day proceeded like any other, until I noticed my friend Jessica had called me multiple times in the afternoon. I picked up Emma from daycare and called Jessica back. "Did you hear about what happened?" she said immediately. "No, what?" I answered, confused. "News outlets were swarming your street about an hour ago. There were even news trucks in your driveway." I sat there in stunned silence. 3 men broke into your neighbor's place last night. They tied him up at gunpoint and stole thousands of dollars worth of items. They took off with his car too. I immediately fell to my knees and began sobbing. I had heard it all happen. I almost pressed that button. I almost did something, but I didn't. I suddenly felt completely unsafe. I asked Jessica to come over and stay with us that night, and it wasn't until the next day that I got a chance to speak with Frank. He explained the whole story and told me the police wanted to talk to me so I could share what I had heard and experienced. Frank said the men had smashed the basement window to get in. That was the sound I heard before going to bed. According to the timeline the police pieced together, they had seen my light on and me looking out the window. So they waited about 30 minutes until my light was out before entering the house. They didn't realize Frank was home, and since he had gone to bed early that night, it was suggested they had been watching his place beforehand. Frank had been asleep when one of them started rummaging through his belongings upstairs in his bedroom, which was directly on the other side of my bedroom wall. The sounds and vibrations I heard and felt were apparently the intruder knocking Frank down to the ground after realizing he was there, then covering his mouth and telling him that if he made another sound, he would kill him. That's why I never heard anything after that as I was investigating. After they tied him up, Frank remained bound for over 12 hours and eventually managed to break free before calling the police. I cried again and apologized profusely to Frank, explaining what I had heard. He simply said that while he was tied up, all he could think about was how glad he was that it didn't happen to me and Emma. I really don't know what I would have done if my daughter and I had to experience that level of trauma firsthand. Frank seemed to be okay considering everything, but it took me so long to feel safe again, and for the guilt to subside. They never caught the perpetrators, and I ended up ordering a taser, which was illegal in Oregon, and got some pepper spray. For the first time in my life, I even considered getting a gun, but I decided against it. I've been fortunate never to experience anything close to that again, and I certainly don't want to. I'm glad Frank was ultimately okay, but next time, I'll listen to my instincts. It's better to be safe than sorry. Last night, I took some melatonin to get to sleep early. I have an American bulldog named Luna who is scared of everything, so I don't think of her as my protector. I feel that I'm her protector, and I'm fine with that. My boyfriend Derek works late shifts, so Luna usually barks when she hears the garage open around 11 p.m. At 10:55 last night, she started going absolutely crazy. At first, I told her to go back to bed. Then I heard my doorbell ringing excessively, accompanied by loud knocking. We never use our front door. Not once have we ever entered through our front door. We always use the garage entrance. My first thought was that Derek's garage opener must be broken or something, but I had no calls or texts from him. Luna was going completely insane. We live in a gated community called Meadowbrook Estates, so I don't usually feel unsafe. I went downstairs with Luna by my side. I can barely see through the peephole because I'm really short, but I could make out a figure standing there. I heard someone screaming, "Help me!" And they were still knocking and using the doorbell repeatedly. I thought Derek was just playing some kind of elaborate prank on me. We have one of those hotel-style chain locks at the top of the door, so you can open it about 2 inches without really opening it completely. I unlocked the deadbolt and turned the doorknob, opening the door just slightly. A man was saying, "Help me," and then started jerking violently on the doorknob. I screamed back, "What do you need help with?" He wouldn't speak clearly and kept jerking the door handle, while Luna was making the meanest, most aggressive sounds I'd ever heard from her. I slammed the door with all my strength and locked it back up. I yelled, "I'm calling the cops," while dialing 911. While on the phone with the dispatcher, he was still ringing the doorbell and beating on the door. The 911 operator could hear it all happening. I felt terrible because I wasn't sure if this person was genuinely hurt. But why wouldn't they explain what was wrong when the door was partially open? Why didn't Luna's fierce barking faze them at all? The stranger kept beating on the door until the police arrived. When they got there, I watched through my window as they put an elderly man in the back of their patrol car. I found out later that it was my neighbor from across the street, Mr. Patterson, whom I'd never actually met and had barely seen before. Apparently, he has dementia and had wandered out of his house in the middle of the night. I felt such overwhelming guilt for calling the police and scaring his wife, Mrs. Patterson. I also felt foolish for how terrified I had been. I watch a lot of true crime shows, and Derek sometimes works until around 4 in the morning. I immediately thought someone had been watching me and knew that I was home alone. I'm not sure if this was the right place to share this story, but it was genuinely terrifying. Now I feel embarrassed, and I keep telling myself that if it had been someone intent on hurting me, I did the wrong thing by opening the door at all, even though it was still locked with the chain. I just keep reassuring myself that I did the right thing, because what was I supposed to do when all I knew was that there was a strange man at my door, acting erratically, and trying to force his way into my house. I feel so bad for Mrs. Patterson. The police made Mr. Patterson take an ambulance to the emergency room to get checked out. That's my scary encounter for 2022, and hopefully for the rest of my life. Hiding in plain sight. I never paid much attention to that phrase before I started my new job. The classified ad was simple. Wanted, nighttime security guard, along with a phone number. The town I live in isn't very big, barely a dot on the map, somewhere you pass through on the way to somewhere else. But for whatever reason, we have a museum. I have no idea how it's still in business. I can't recall ever seeing a single person walk through their doors. But when I called the number, the man who answered told me to come to this address this evening for my interview. He seemed overly excited that I'd answered the ad. When I asked him about the job, he said, "Oh, you know, the usual thing for a security guard." I've read some pretty unusual things about security guards on various forums, but I'm sure those stories are made up. Walking up the pristine white stone steps built to accommodate crowds of people was intimidating and creepy, with no one for company besides the glowing lamps mounted on the sides of the railings. The whole thing gave off a very dystopian ghost town, zombie, apocalypse vibe. The stone gargoyle staring down at me didn't help much either. I gazed into their eyes, half expecting them to jump down and carry me off to be sacrificed to some ancient god. If I hadn't already discussed my hourly wage, I would have turned and hightailed it home. But the wage was more than acceptable for a security guard. It was downright generous. I was wondering why he would pay so much, but walking up those desolate stairs gave me a clue. Nobody wanted to go near this place. The word haunted had been mentioned more than once by locals. Looking up at the front of the building, the sporadic lights made shadows fall all around and gave it an intimidating presence. I paused at the top of the stairs, thinking about every horror movie I've ever seen. There's always that one moment where the characters could turn back and live another day, but they never do. The wind whipped up, blowing against me, threatening to push me back down the stairs, almost as if warning me not to go inside. For a moment, I considered heeding the warning and climbing back down the stairs. Knowing that my rent and car payment were due made me reevaluate that decision. I stepped up and opened the door, wondering if I would ever come out. Fully expecting the door to creak on its hinges, I was pleasantly surprised when it opened silently and with little effort, despite feeling quite heavy. The ornate decorations and beautiful decor took my breath away. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I found myself regretting that this was the first time I'd ever visited this museum. I hadn't made it 2 steps when an elegantly dressed man appeared and smiled at me. He didn't so much walk up to me as glide, showing an air of dignity bordering on royalty. "Mr. Wellington, I presume," he said, wearing a warm smile. "Yes, sir," I replied, offering my hand. He glanced at it with an amused look. "Right then, follow me, and I'll show you your duties," he said, turning on his heels and gliding away. I pretended to smooth my hair as I followed, feeling like an idiot for offering my hand. He glided past several works of art toward a small desk. "Right then," he said, "you'll be in charge of checking the doors so nothing gets in." He paused. "Or out," he finished. "You mean stolen?" I asked. "Yes," he said slowly. "Stolen, so I got the job?" I asked. He stared at me blankly. "Did you show up?" I nodded. You got the job. Do I need a uniform or anything? Let's see how your first night goes, he said. There's a set of rules on the paper on your desk. Please adhere to them. You must do at least 1 round per night through every room and check every door. 1 round, that's it, I asked. This place is rather large and challenging. I looked around with a hint of hesitation. Maybe there was a reason why it paid so much. He smiled. If you have any problems, just call the number on the paper, he said. That's it, I queried. I believe so. I'll lock the door on my way out and unlock it again at 9 o'clock on my way back in. I stepped over to the desk and began reading the paper. What does this mean? I said, turning around, but he was gone. Hello, I called, but only my voice echoed back to me. I looked at the puzzling paper again and read the rules. Rule number 1, there are no rules. Rule number 2, there are no rules. What is this fight club? I said to myself. Every time you break a rule, return to rule number 1. Wait a minute. How can I break a rule when there are no rules? Rule number 3. How you follow the rules is as important as why you follow the rules. That made no sense at all. Rule number 4. If you are caught breaking the rules, the penalties may be severe. Okay, something's wrong here. This is just talking in circles. I read back over the rules, and they looked strange. More than just the strangeness of the rules/non-rules themselves, it was the way they were written. I went back and looked at each letter, paying attention to the letters that were capitalized. It looked like some hidden message. I put them together and they said, "They are watching." I hesitated. Who's watching? I decided to keep reading, hoping that this would begin to make some sense. Rule number 5. Do not, under any circumstances, make noise during your rounds. Message received. Don't move. I stood there immobile, wondering how long I was meant to play this game, and if someone would come by and tag me to unfreeze me and allow me to start my round. As I waited, chuckling to myself at the ludicrousness of this insane game of freeze tag, I felt the air grow cold. Clouds of breath puffed out of my mouth like an old steam train as I fought the urge to rub my arms. A chill that had little to do with the sudden temperature drop ran down my spine as I felt a presence in the room. It crept up behind me, silent as the grave. I could feel its hot breath wash over me as it sniffed the air around my neck. Instead of enjoying the sudden warmth, my temperature plummeted even further. My heart hammered in my chest. It was all I could do to keep from running away in sheer terror as it passed by. I was overwhelmed by the stench of death. This thing was every nightmare I've ever had personified. I refused to open my eyes and see its hideous form for fear of passing out. Instead, I focused on imitating a statue, which was nearly impossible with my freezing body aching to shiver in frozen dread. The nameless terror passed to the far side of the room, taking some of the cold with it. And then, as suddenly as it came, it was gone. The room returned to normal temperature, but I waited a few moments before moving, just to be sure. Once I felt it was safe, I nearly collapsed to the floor in relief. After giving myself a moment to recover, I glanced at the paper with newfound fear. Was this a harbinger of doom, or a warning label meant to keep me safe? Unsure if I wanted to read the rest, I took a moment to reevaluate my current career choice. Could I just walk out and say I quit? After a brief internal debate, I decided it wasn't worth the money if I was about to be dragged through a portal to hell. Just a short time ago, I would have considered that thought laughably ludicrous, but it was seeming more plausible by the moment. I started toward the exit door with every intention of calling and telling my boss I wouldn't be finishing the shift. Unfortunately, the door had other plans. When I pushed on the crash bar, nothing happened. I tried turning the deadbolt, but it refused to move. After a few minutes of futility, I gave up, frustrated and determined to just sit in the room until morning came around. Sitting at the desk, I spun around in the chair, waiting for the next 9 hours and 13 minutes to pass quickly. 5 minutes later, out of sheer boredom, I glanced at the paper. Rule number 6. You can't just sit at the desk and wait for the door to open upon the ending of your shift. Are you serious? I said in frustration. Someone thinks they're funny, huh? Glancing back at the paper, below Rule 6 were 3 letters. Yes. I backed away and got up to do my round, if nothing else than to get away from this all-seeing sheet of paper that I'd grown to be afraid to look at. Hesitating, I reached for the door to the room where the nightmare had disappeared. Glancing up, I saw a slip of paper taped to the door. It said, "The only way out is through." Sighing heavily, my trembling hand turned the knob and slowly opened the door. As I closed it, on the other side was another slip of paper. This one said, "Avoid eye contact and you'll be fine." Confused by the cryptic statement, I turned and realized what it meant. The room was full of stuffed creatures of many shapes and sizes. Most of them seemed to be mythical in nature, of the cryptid variety. There was a Bigfoot, a skinwalker, a dogman, a Jersey devil, a wendigo, and many others. As my eyes scanned the room, I noticed movement. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The skinwalker turned its head just slightly to look right at me. I quickly darted my eyes away in fear and disbelief. When the dogman turned its head to stare at me, panic coursed through my veins. I turned to go back through the door, remembering what the piece of paper on both sides of the door said. The only way out is through, and avoid eye contact, and you'll be fine. I thought that last statement was akin to saying, if you hold on tight enough on a roller coaster, you won't need the safety harness. Aiming my eyes at the floor, I turned and started toward the far side of the room. I hoped that all they would do was watch. That hope was dashed when I heard growls and footsteps from all around the room. Hesitating, I wondered if I would need a clean pair of pants by the time I reached the far side, that is, if I survived. The sounds of footsteps grew louder behind me when suddenly there was a pair of heavy legs blocking my path. I stopped as a low growl made the air vibrate around me. "Oh dear God," I whispered, knowing that my life was about to end horribly and painfully. Fighting the urge to look up, I sidestepped and went around the legs, hoping to pass unnoticed. I counted my footsteps, hoping each one wouldn't be my last, silently praying as I continued toward the door with my eyes aimed down, watching nothing more than my feet. It seemed like the longest walk of my life, listening to the mythical creatures behind me come to life and surround me, every bit like they were following me, just waiting for the right moment to grab me and turn me into a late-night snack. It came as a surprise when I bumped my head into the far wall. Shocked not only that I had made it, but that I had missed the door, I glanced over and found my glorious escape route. As I opened the door, I accidentally glanced back into the room and made eye contact with the wendigo. Its roar of rage is something I'll never forget. It charged at me with blinding speed, claws unsheathed and fangs ready to tear me to shreds. I dove through the door in the nick of time, slamming it behind me. The impact on the other side of the wall made dust settle to the floor, causing me to sneeze. I stood and saw another piece of paper taped to the door. "Whatever you do, don't make a sound," it said. As I was about to make a comment about it being too late, a giant set of fangs flew at me from the semi-darkness. Attached to them was the biggest snake I'd ever seen or heard of. It shook off the impact with the door as my legs took over and sprinted for the far side of the room. The dim lighting made it impossible to see the far door clearly, as well as rocks and other obstacles littering the floor. As I made my desperate dash to safety, I swear the rock that tripped me moved into my path on its own. Instead of a death sentence, it saved my life as the snake flew over my prone body. Had I not tripped, its massive fangs would have gone straight through me. Not waiting around to celebrate my accidental good fortune, I jumped up and raced toward the door again. It was now within sight, but so was the snake. It had recovered and was coiling for another strike. Running around a large boulder to make myself a harder target, I aimed for a spot 5 feet from the door. When I was almost to the door, I dove just as the snake passed over me, slamming into the wall. As I jumped up and opened the door, closing it behind me, I took a moment to catch my breath and think about asking a lot more questions when I interview for my next job. I tried to open my eyes but realized they were already open. The room was engulfed in total darkness. Pulling out my flashlight, I shone it around but couldn't see anything aside from the door and the floor in front of me. There was no sign of anything in the room, not even a ceiling. It was as if the darkness sucked the light into itself, never to escape. Being robbed of sight, I relied on hearing. Taking a long listen, I waited to hear any growls or slithers, anything to give me a hint of what I might have to deal with. But there was nothing, only soul-crushing silence. Having scanned the room the best I could, I set out to find the far door. Nothing seemed strange. Even the echo sounded like a normal large room. It was just devoid of light. The normalness of it terrified me. All I could detect out of place was a slight scent of disinfectant. I wasn't sure if that was because whatever horrible creature that called this room its home had killed people here and they wanted to cover the smell, or if the creature itself had passed away, leaving some poor janitor to clean up the mess. They say that when one of your senses fails, the others become more acute to make up for it. The same thing was happening with my paranoia. I imagined shadows moving around in the total pitch of darkness. My steps were small and slow as my arms waved in front of me, acting as my eyes, searching for any obstacles. It took what seemed like an eternity to try to get to the far side. Walking so slowly, I guess that's the price for being careful. As I approached the wall, the flashlight and vision became useful once again. I must have gotten off track as I walked because the door was far off to the side. I had to walk a good 50 feet along the wall to find it. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a horrible sight. The snake was coiled up in front of it. I quickly shut the door as it prepared to strike. Why would they have 2 snake rooms? Then a terrible answer came to mind. It wasn't a second snake. It was the same one. I must have gotten turned around in the darkness and done a complete circle. As my brain tried to cope with denial, I tried to figure out a way to get across this room without unintentionally doubling back, keeping in mind that even though I had yet to see or hear anything in this room, that didn't mean it wasn't there. Searching for any ideas, I looked down at my flashlight, then squared my shoulders against the wall to regain my bearings, and tossed the flashlight straight in front of me. It landed with a loud clatter, then rolled around in a playful circle before coming to a rest. If there was anything in the room, most likely I had just woken it up and showed it exactly where I was. I stood still and listened. After a few minutes, I didn't hear any movement. It seemed safe to walk to my flashlight, pick it up, and toss it another 15 feet, hopefully in a straight line. I did this the whole way across the room, still listening for sounds, but becoming more confident with each step that I wouldn't hear any. The door was just a few feet to the side of where I'd aimed. Somehow, I'd gone in a straight line. Grabbing the doorknob, I slowly turned it so as not to alert the snake if, by some trick, I ended up back in that room. But there was no trick and no snake. The door opened to blinding light. I covered my eyes to give them time to adjust. Once they had acclimated, I looked around at a beautiful room full of clouds. There were even clouds on the floor. It was disconcerting at first, and almost made me lose my balance, because they were so beautifully painted that it literally looked like I was walking on clouds. I took a tentative step into the room, making sure that it was an illusion, and I wasn't about to fall thousands of feet to my death. Holding my breath, I stepped onto the first cloud and let go of the door frame. It was firm, like a floor should be. My second and third steps were more confident as I realized how effective the illusion was. Once I got used to it, walking on clouds was actually fun. This was turning out to be the easiest room I'd been in so far. That's when I heard the scream. It was deafening and seemed to come from everywhere at once. I dove to the floor, only to realize there was nowhere to hide from whatever it was. I stood out like a sore thumb against the blue sky, and white fluffy clouds painted on every surface in the room. The scream sounded again, and I began to run, having no idea which way I was going or where the scream was coming from. For all I knew, I was running toward whatever it was. I just knew it didn't sound human, and I had no desire to find out what it was. Soon the choice was taken out of my hands. I saw a dark spot appear against the clouds that quickly became larger. It was almost on me when I dove to the floor, feeling something sharp scrape my back. Pain shot through me as I reached around and found the back of my shirt in shreds. Not only that, but my hand was covered in blood. Whatever it was had sliced my back open, and I was bleeding. Adrenaline kicked in, and I ran faster than I ever have. The problem was I didn't know where I was running to or what I was running from. I was just running. I heard wings flapping and looked back just in time to see the largest bird of prey I'd ever seen. It looked like a golden eagle, only the thing was massive. The wingspan was easily 20 feet. As I was running, I turned to get a closer look at this thing. At the same time I was trying to get away from it, my feet got tangled up, and I fell backward just as the razor-sharp talons passed over, mere inches away from my face. I jumped up and started running again. As I glanced back to find my attacker, I was met with the strangest sight. There was a smear of blood on the floor where I had just been laying. It looked like someone had wiped blood on a cloud. The wings flapped again. I knew it was close. I had run out of luck. It would be ready for anything this time. Its razor-sharp talons would rip me to pieces. There was no doubt about it. There was only one option. I jumped and whipped around in midair, throwing my flashlight as hard as I could. It connected with its head, which was mere feet away. It screamed and dove off to the side, impacting the floor so hard I felt the vibration and landing in a heap. I didn't stop to check on it. The door loomed ahead of me, and I pushed myself for every ounce of speed my body could muster. Turning the knob and opening the door in one smooth motion, I dove through it and slammed it shut. Laying on the floor, breathing hard, trying to catch my breath, I knew I was a sitting duck for whatever monster lurked in this room. I rolled over to get in some defensive position for whatever was about to attack. When I saw I was back in the main hall, I had somehow survived my first, and as far as I was concerned, last round. I stumbled my way to the restroom, in the back of my mind wondering what kind of insanity I would find there. Would I have to crawl through the mirror into another dimension to get a roll of toilet paper? Fortunately, the restroom held no surprises. I took off my destroyed shirt and ran water over it to clean my back up as best as I could. When I was done, I put some paper towels on the wound and put my jacket on top of it. The desk and chair were where I spent the rest of the night. Surprisingly, it had taken me almost an hour to complete the round. As I sat there, pondering if I could survive another night at this job, I saw a dark spot form on the wall and detach itself, only to float over toward me. I closed my eyes and sat perfectly still, ignoring the sudden drop in temperature. The stench of death surrounded me, but I refused to move. For a moment, I thought I heard a sound like sniffing, and then it seemed to diminish. Once the temperature rose again, I opened my eyes, and the apparition was gone. As bored as I was for the next few hours, I wasn't tempted to do another round, not even in the slightest. When 9 o'clock rolled around, the boss/curator appeared and glided over to me, wearing a little grin. "I see you managed to make it through," he said. "Congratulations, you're the first one in some time." "The first one to make it through a single round?" I asked. He nodded. "How many others have there been?" I said with a haunted look in my eyes. He shook his head. "Let's not worry about that, shall we?" he said. "Here's the amount we agreed upon." He handed me a stack of bills, and I gladly took them. "Would you be interested in staying on and being my permanent nighttime guard?" I looked at the money and sighed. As much as I'd like to, I don't see how this job could be called permanent when the mortal danger is so real. It is a challenge, I'll admit. However, you rose to it last night, he said. I'm prepared to offer you twice the amount I gave you if you agree to stay on. I stared at the fistful of money and imagined not having to struggle with bills or any other expenses. Then I turned a little, and my back painfully reminded me of the dangers. I'd have to think about it, I said. While you're thinking, consider this. You have yet to see the basement. Basement? I questioned. He nodded. It's considerably more challenging, he added. I'll let you know, I replied. Very well, you can see yourself out. I recommend getting that back looked at. With that, he vanished into thin air right in front of my eyes. I looked at the money, wondering if it would vanish as well. Fortunately, it remained firmly in my grasp. As I walked toward the front door, for some reason, I felt hesitant to open it and leave. It was as if some force was exerting itself against me, like the museum didn't want me to go. It wasn't a pleasant feeling, more like a dog losing its favorite toy. I pushed the doors open and left. This whole ordeal made me ponder my concepts of reality, as well as being terrified of the day when the things in the building would escape somehow. The question was, did I need the money that badly? Was I willing to put myself in mortal peril just for a few measly dollars. I turned and looked back at the museum. In the daylight, it looked innocent. None of the terrors that lay within showed on the outside. As I turned to head home, I swore I saw a fleeting glimpse of the apparition. It seemed to be following me. I looked again, and it was gone. It must have been my imagination. I'm not sure how smart it is to give out personal information after something I thought could only happen in movies actually happened to me. But I'm scared about what this could all mean, and I want people to hear and know about this. If something happens to me, I assure you I'm on no medication, suffer from no mental illnesses, have no history of trauma of any kind, and anything else you might think of. I am a completely average person living a completely average life. Well, I was, I guess, up until now. My name is Jessica, and I'm from a small town in Texas where everyone knows each other. I work as a 911 operator. My family lives in a rural town out of state, and I haven't spoken to them about this, yet out of fear that whatever's going on might somehow affect them too if I get them involved. Yesterday, I began my night shift the same way I do every evening. Most of the time, I get low priority calls and a few prank calls. And since I've been doing this for a few years now, I've grown quite good at discerning what's an actually concerning call versus what's not. The shift was rather tame up until I got what I initially thought was a prank call. 911, what's your emergency? I spoke into the phone after returning my cup of coffee to the desk and readjusting myself in my chair. Someone's outside my house. They've been looking around my yard and peering through my windows for the past 2 minutes, came the voice of a woman on the other end. Her voice sounded familiar ever since the first few words, but I couldn't quite place it yet. She spoke very fast. It was obvious how nervous she was about this situation. No surprise there, I would be too. I thought it was a friend of mine at first, but I don't know this person and they look off, she continued. Okay, ma'am, I said, nudging my chair closer to the desk as I began typing on the computer. I asked the lady another question while typing. Can you give me your address and tell me if you can see whether this person is armed? Yeah, I'm at the yellow house at the end of Maple Street, the woman continued. But I admit I didn't listen to the rest. She had just given me my house address. I stopped my fingers in the middle of typing, thinking this must be one of my friends. We're a small group and very mischievous toward each other, sort of out of character for our age, I must admit. But I've said numerous times how serious prank calling 911 can be for people. Who is this? You know how badly this can end for you, right? I reached for my coffee cup, rolling my eyes, and held my hand ready to hang up the call. But she continued, What? I don't get it. I'm serious, please don't hang up, she retorted in a tone that caught me off guard. Then, after a second, she returned to the previous, somewhat panicked attitude. I'm sorry, but this isn't a joke. Please, I'm afraid of what this person might do. Okay, ma'am. I put the cup back on the desk and was ready to prolong this call to enough of an extent to make this woman face the consequences for tying up the line. What bad luck for her, I thought, to get the operator living at the exact house she decided would be her target. What's your name and which room are you in right now? I'm Jessica. I'm looking out my bedroom window right now. They're still there. My blood started to run cold. How senseless this person must be. It was obviously a friend. I raised my voice this time, warning them again about how badly they would regret their actions if they prank called again. Just as I was about to hang up, Jessica started to beg me frantically not to. For whatever reason, something inside me was telling me to listen. I decided to give her one more chance, and then I would send the police over to arrest this prank caller, and at the very least, give her a slap on the wrist. "Okay, Jessica, describe the bedroom to me," I said. "What?" she asked, confused. "You heard me. What color are the curtains? Is there any furniture, lamps? Tell me what you can see." Though I've known my friends for quite a while now, none of them have ever been in my house. I prefer it that way, not because I don't trust them to enter my house, but because I've never been fond of having guests. Neither were my parents when I was little. It's something they had that transferred over to me. There was no way this person would know what my bedroom looked like. Purple curtains, queen-sized bed with a grayish comforter with white stripes, a wardrobe, and a small bedside table with a reading lamp on it. She went on for a few seconds while I listened, completely dumbfounded. She was describing exactly how my bedroom looked. Her next words snapped me out of the confusion. "Jessica, why are you asking me this? There's someone outside my house." I couldn't answer her immediately. This was just so surreal, nothing like anything I'd experienced so far in this job. This woman, apparently named Jessica, who sounds just like me, claiming she lives at my address and is standing in the exact same bedroom as mine, was talking to me. How did any of this make sense? I tried to keep my cool and continue talking to her normally, but I could hear the shakiness in my own voice when all I could mutter was, "Okay, ma'am," before falling silent again and rummaging around my desk drawer to find my personal phone. My ex-boyfriend had installed security cameras facing the front, back, and sides of our house at different angles. After some people started talking about the same car driving around their homes multiple times during the day and night. Nothing ever came of it, but it didn't hurt to have the extra security measure. I never thought I'd actually have to use it. I opened the app while this Jessica kept repeating, "Hello," but I was too preoccupied to answer. I admit my heart dropped into my stomach at this point, and it only got worse after I opened the camera app. My bedroom window looked out on one of the sides of my house, and right beyond the wooden fence was someone pacing left and right while looking up at the house. I finally snapped back. "Okay, Jessica, okay. I'm sending a patrol car your way immediately. Excuse the delay." I tried to regain my composure, but could still hear my words trembling as I spoke them out loud. While the person wasn't trespassing, and technically not committing any crime, what puzzled me more was that I was currently completely free of any alcohol or drug influence, talking to myself, to another me. "Move away from the window to make sure he doesn't see you. Do you?" I paused for a moment, taking in how ridiculous the whole situation was again, and finished my question, listening intently for the other answer that was about to come from the other Jessica. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to hear. "Do you have a weapon in your house you could use in case his intentions become hostile?" I asked. "I mean, the only thing I can think of right now are the knives in the kitchen. And there's an old pistol, but it's in the basement, and the door to it is outside. Am I going to have to defend myself?" She sounded stressed out as she asked, but I was more shocked to hear the same exact words I would have said in response to this question. "I have a pistol, and it's in the basement, the door to which is outside." Still unable to comprehend all of this, I told Jessica, or me, I guess, to check again and see where the person was. And I reassured her that the patrol car was only a few minutes away from the house. Only now did I finally look around, thinking that I must be dreaming. And I caught the gaze of a fellow coworker who had his eyebrow raised. He must have been listening to my conversation and saw me acting strangely. But I tried to smile to the best of my ability and nod quickly, returning my focus to my screen before I could see his reaction. "Jessica, do you see them still?" I inquired, but got no response for another few moments. She then stumbled on her words, and I could hear the door creaking open, just as my bedroom door does, and her footsteps rapidly moving from room to room, presumably looking out other windows. No, he's not out there now. I don't know where he is. Oh God, did I miss him? Is he coming toward my house? She sounded like she was on the verge of a panic attack. I did my best trying to calm her down while searching for the person myself, switching between different cameras. When I found him, I saw him in the backyard with an arm raised in the air. Moments later, a rock flew toward my kitchen window, and though the cameras have no audio, Jessica's shriek was perfectly timed in sync with the impact. "Holy shit, he just broke one of my windows." She yelled frantically and began raving inaudibly into the phone. Jessica, get to your attic quickly. The police will be at your place soon. Use anything you find up there to block the way in," I yelled back, raising my voice loud enough to overshadow hers and probably scare my coworkers with the sudden decibel increase. Whatever was happening, it was real. There was someone outside my house who had just broken a window, and I was in there, afraid for my life. The advice I gave her was exactly what I would have done. The attic hatch is in the middle of the hallway leading from the living room to my bedroom, giving her enough time to get up there and block it afterward. Considering this person had to pass through the kitchen and then through the aforementioned parts of the house, by my calculations, Jessica had enough time to get there and use all the stored boxes and whatever else she could find to hold the hatch shut for the little time left until the police arrived. I could hear Jessica slam the door behind her and run down the laminated hallway toward the hatch. And then I gasped audibly as she yelled into the speaker, and the phone dropped with a loud thud. Her footsteps became more and more distant as another, heavier set made their way faster and faster through the hallway and closer to the phone. "Are you still there? The police are almost at your location," was all I could think to say in my last effort to scare whoever this person was away. A few seconds of silence passed, and I expected to hear something, anything. Some scary, cryptic remark, or at least breathing, but there was nothing. My last word into the receiver was an empty hello, before the other end hung up. I couldn't believe what had just happened, and must have been sitting at my desk, staring into the screen, for at least 2 minutes before the same coworker from earlier, Marcus, came and put his hand on my shoulder, prompting me to scream and push him away. The entire office looked our way, and he put his hands up in the air. I apologized profusely, more times than I could count. Everyone turned back to their desks, and Marcus lowered his hands. "Tough call?" he asked, leaning on my desk and handing me a chocolate bar. "You seemed really on edge the entire time, and well, this just confirms it." I didn't even acknowledge the snack after I looked at it, and just met his eyes again, not knowing what to say. I began with a few disconnected words before excusing myself and leaving the shift early. It's a little after 2:30 as I finish writing this. I booked myself a room in the most crowded hotel I could find, with the room closest to the stairs leading to the reception. I'm shutting the blinds and locking the door twice. I'm afraid to go home, and I don't know who to talk to about this without sounding completely insane. I've heard nothing from the responding police officers yet, and I don't know what to do about this tomorrow. Anyone listening to this, please believe me, and even if you don't, can you please offer me some advice? A quick update, I just woke up. It's 4:16 a.m. 5 minutes ago. 2 calls from someone with no caller ID woke me up, but I didn't pick up. I'm afraid for my safety. I sat on the cushioned armchair in the hotel room Jessica had rented after running off inexplicably from her shift last night. I had called her earlier this morning after finishing work without even going to sleep. She's always been level-headed, and her acting like this made me feel concerned. I couldn't just let it go, and now here I was, listening to how she apparently spoke to herself last night on the phone. "Jessica, are you sure these night shifts aren't a bit too much for you?" I asked, though I wanted to trust her. "What you're describing to me sounds straight out of a book or a movie, and the lack of sleep really takes a toll bigger than you can even comprehend. I'm not saying you're making this up, but maybe you just remembered it wrong." Jessica paced around the room with one hand resting on her hip and the other held up to her forehead, pushing her hair back, and exhaled loudly. "I know how insane this sounds, Marcus, but I'm telling you, I'm 100% certain about what I heard and saw on those cameras. There was another me in that house last night, and some person broke my damn window. How can you be taking this so calmly? We haven't even heard from the responders yet, and it's been more than 6 hours." She was right. There had been no information back to us on that call, nothing on the news, no contact from the officers. When I used Jessica's phone to try and call back whoever it was that woke her up, there was nothing. I told her that while I couldn't explain the call itself, I agreed that it was too dangerous for her to go back home, considering there was an intruder. I offered her to stay at my place for the next few days, and while she agreed and thanked me, she wouldn't let the topic of her other self go. I understood her to some extent, but I was still skeptical. So I offered her to go back to my place so I could change and grab the pistol I kept locked in my safe and a flashlight. Then we could look for the officers at her house ourselves. She was afraid, but I think the curiosity and stress about what might have happened to the supposed other her prevailed, and was what made her agree to this plan. I waited for her to get her things out of the room, and I drove back to my house. In the meantime, I asked her about any details she might have missed about the call to make sure we were going in prepared. The drive to her house wasn't long, and during it, I tried to play some music to lighten the mood or talk to her about anything so I could distract her. But all I got was 1 or 2 words in response, while she was lost in thought, looking out the window. When we arrived, I parked in her driveway where, just outside, sat the police car with the 2 front doors slightly ajar, with no sign of the officers. Jessica's breathing quickened, and I put a hand on her shoulder to calm her down. Then, without anything being said, both of us got out of the car. The first thing we did was walk up to the police car and see if there was anything out of the ordinary, like slashed tires or any signs of a struggle. But it was parked there like any other vehicle, and there was nothing obvious on the inside. What I discovered, though, was the radio, which, while it didn't look like it had been tampered with, was not working. I walked back toward the house and called for Jessica to walk with me as we circled it from a distance, finding the broken window leading into the kitchen. I was just about to suggest calling 911 again and having them go into the house while we waited outside, but Jessica snapped before I could even begin to speak. "Why the hell is nothing being done about this?" She raised her hands in the air and turned to look at me, her blue eyes conveying a mixture of anger and confusion. "2 policemen have disappeared since responding to this call. There was an intruder in my home, and there was literally a clone or something of me inside while I was at work. Tell me why we haven't heard anything about this, Marcus." I don't know, okay. If everything happened like you say it did, it just doesn't make sense. I cut her off before she started talking again, knowing that she would jump on me for accusing her of lying. But we really should just let the authorities handle this. We are not professionals. Jessica tried to get something out, but just cut herself off and shook her head. I thought she had given in and would do the logical thing and take my advice. Instead, she turned and walked a few steps toward her back door and then looked back at me. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I'm going in. No one's going to listen to me anyway, and I'm not about to leave here without at least some kind of answer or clue," she answered. I stared at her, completely taken aback, and waited a few seconds to see if she would say anything else. But she just stayed there, looking right at me. I knew deep down she was hoping I would say that I would be going in with her. Well, before I did that, I tried to convince her to think this through again, but that was obviously not going to work. So that's just what I did, but I have to admit, I was getting nervous myself. The back door was unlocked and led into a different hallway than the one she told me about, which I figured out by the lack of an attic hatch. Jessica told me the layout of her home, and we walked together, me in front of her and my weapon drawn as I called out, asking if anyone was there. She smacked my shoulder and raised her arms with wide eyes, and I shushed her. We had no way of knowing if there was an intruder or police officers or both, and I didn't want blood on my hands, no matter whose. As you might expect, we got no response from anywhere and heard nothing that might indicate there being anyone else here with us. We found nothing out of the ordinary in the rooms of Jessica's home, but the hallway with the attic had some things worth noting. The first being what we immediately saw: the phone on the ground and slight marks like scratches on the walls, which were the only signs of anything out of the ordinary, besides the broken window. "That must be what she used to call," Jessica said, grabbing it and trying to turn it on, but it had no battery left. The screen was slightly cracked at the top right edge, probably where it first impacted the floor. "What the hell is going on, Marcus?" "Calm down," I began, knowing that she wouldn't listen to me. "There's only the attic and the basement left for us to look through. We can check up there and then go down last. How's that sound?" "Yeah, okay, but the basement's locked. If the key hasn't been moved, it must be in one of my bedroom drawers," she replied. "All right, I'll check out the attic while you grab the key. There's no point in both of us going up there." I raised my weapon into the air while reaching for my flashlight. "Don't worry about me." Jessica nodded and began walking toward the bedroom, disappearing past the door after I started ascending into the attic. There was nothing on top of the hatch, which I realized before even looking around to see, because of how easily I was able to lift it open. This confirmed our suspicions that the other woman hadn't made it up there before the end of the call. What immediately struck me as odd was the immediate drop in temperature here. Yeah, it was an attic, but the difference must have been at least 10 degrees, and I shivered as I made my way up and started shining the light across the entire space. Behind empty old boxes, worn-out furniture, and various other items not worth noting, there was no place for anyone to hide up here. Or at least not if you ask me, because I looked through every nook and cranny there was, and found no traces of anyone or anything. Walking back, I started descending the ladder and called for Jessica, but I got no response. I wasn't immediately concerned because the hatch was left open, and if anything had happened, I would have heard it. Waiting for a few seconds and remaining without a response, I made my way toward the bedroom, which was just as empty as when we looked in there together earlier. I called for her again and started looking through each of the rooms. While doing that, I paused for a moment to listen, but not for Jessica. The background noises from earlier, like birds or passing cars, had all stopped. Again, that didn't strike me as odd at that moment. Looking through the rest of the rooms proved fruitless, and I thought that maybe she had gone outside, probably waiting for me by the basement. So I made my way to the back door and opened it. It led me back into the living room. I blinked and looked behind me. I was certainly in the same corridor we were first in when entering the house. Despite that, I shut the door and turned back to exit from the front of the house. When I opened that one, I was greeted with the kitchen. I just stood there for a few seconds, unable to take in what was happening. I rubbed my eyes, but here I was, still inside the house, standing right at the front door, which was leading me back inside. I walked through and approached the window that was broken by the intruder. Instead of the green yard, the street parked with cars, and neighboring houses, I was greeted by a view into the bedroom. My heart started pounding, and I admit that I was on the verge of a panic attack. I started sweating profusely, and my heart felt like it was about to jump out of my chest as I began running from room to room, door through door, trying to get out. Again and again, I found myself in different parts of the house. I had to stop and sit down for a few moments before I passed out. While regaining my composure, I saw something odd. Not that this situation wasn't far more disturbing than I'm giving it credit for. I noticed that the walls of the living room where I was currently sitting had changed color, and half the coffee table was just missing. Like, imagine a bug or glitch in some video game where half a piece of furniture is there and the rest is gone. The table still had two of its legs on which it was standing completely fine, but the surface was cut diagonally, and the rest of it just wasn't even there. I waved my hand through where it was supposed to be, and it just swiped right through the air. I continued walking through different rooms, and the changes began getting more and more apparent. Like the chandelier in the kitchen was just upside down and sitting in the middle of the air, attached to nothing. It was physically there, and when I tried pushing it, it wouldn't move, but I could feel and touch it. I don't know how long I spent in this place, but for the first time in what was now feeling like hours, I heard a noise. Breathing. Rapid, scared breathing, just like mine when I found myself here. It was coming from the neighboring room. I couldn't say which one, as by now it had been a gamble where I'd end up. I ended up appearing back in the bedroom, where I was greeted by a gruesome sight of a tall man with torn clothing and wounds, superficial and deep, all over his body, lying in a messy pool of blood and something dark mixed with it. some of which was also splattered on the wall behind him, where I saw some scratch marks similar to the ones on the wall from the hallway earlier. It was as if I'd had an instantaneous flashback after seeing him. What remained of his clothing was the same as what the person who had broken into Jessica's home was wearing. He was still alive, but his eyes were red, and he screamed as he saw me. I did the same in reaction. "No, no, no. Get away from me. Get away from me." He yelled through painful inhales and tried to muster up strength to throw one of his shoes at me, but it only got over his leg and was barely any further away from him. "Get the fuck away. I'm not going to hurt you." "Look, I started. "You're not real, not real." Taking the risk of giving him a heart attack that would finally take him out of his misery, I rushed by his side and held my hands in the air, yelling loud enough to silence him. I started shooting every question I could think of at him. When he stopped trying to talk over me, I grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him. He looked as if he was about to faint at any moment now. I asked him what this place was, why he broke in if he knew Jessica, and I could barely get any coherent response out of him until he grasped my right arm with strength he didn't look like he had, which left me shocked and silent. During my time of silence, he spoke, "Not people, fake." Before I could inquire or he could reveal more himself, I was suddenly thrown into the wall next to the man. I couldn't even yell in reaction to the pain. Another blow struck me right in the ribs, and the pain was so unexpected and strong I held my eyes shut and clutched at my sides. Amidst the chaos, I could hear the man scream, and suddenly, what I assumed happened was that he got thrown away. His screams continued but faded in the distance, and I heard a crash and glass breaking mere moments later. Just as I was about to open my eyes, I was grabbed by one of my arms and flung right back out of the room's door. Suddenly, all the noise stopped, and I stayed curled in a ball on the floor, tears of pain streaming down my cheeks as I held my hands over where I'd been kicked or punched or whatever happened. I assumed I had at least 2 broken ribs, and I could barely touch the area without sharp pain shooting through me. When I opened my eyes, I found myself back in the attic. But this time, I could hear Jessica yelling for me downstairs. I slowly got myself back up, holding my side while descending back down into the corridor. I could hear the neighborhood sounds had returned. "I'm here," I shouted, and sat on the floor while waiting for her to arrive. When she did, she gasped and ran at me, putting a hand on my shoulder and asking me what happened and how I got hurt. "We have to get out of here," she said, helping me get up and allowing me to lean on her as we started walking out. "I'll explain at the hotel." I allowed her to drive, and she kept asking me questions in the meantime, but I was too exhausted and in pain to respond coherently. We arrived at the parking lot, and she turned to face me, looking me in the eyes and saying something I didn't even register at that point. I was too caught up in a small detail that I knew I would have noticed for all the time I'd known her. "Jessica, since when are your eyes 2 different colors?" Even thinking about retelling this story has made me more afraid than I've ever been in my entire life. I suppose if I keep it bottled up inside, I'll go completely insane. God knows the security company isn't talking about what happened. I feel like if I don't warn people and they go there, well, if I'm telling this story, then I'd better back it up with some context. It started a little over a month ago. I work for a security firm called North Star Security that handles projects all over the Pacific Northwest. I'm sort of a specialist, it seems. Whenever there's some weird situation happening at a site, I get called in. I'm not sure why exactly. Maybe it's my former military background, or maybe it's the fact that, well, we'll get to that part later. This place up in the mountains of Washington State was having some serious trouble. A local construction firm was renovating an old church when workers suddenly started quitting. No one seemed to have a good reason why they didn't want to work there anymore. So guess who got the call to come in and straighten things out? Driving up there gave me the most profound feeling of isolation I've ever experienced. And mind you, I've sat watching caves, foxholes, and ditches in some of the most godforsaken places on the planet, all by myself. And never did I feel as soul-crushingly alone as I did driving up that narrow 2-lane mountain road. It was the only sign of civilization, as the towering pine trees seemed to close in on me from every side. As unnerving as that drive was, it was nothing compared to pulling into the little town where the church was located. It was like a nightmare scene from a B-horror movie. I guess arriving at night in the middle of a thunderstorm didn't help matters. I pulled up beside the only vehicle I could see and ran inside what looked like a saloon straight out of an old western. I barely got the door closed before there was a bright light and a gun barrel shoved in my face. "Who the hell are you?" said a man from somewhere behind the glare of a flashlight. "Thompson," I said slowly, raising my hands. "I was called in to help you out with your worker problem." The light lowered slightly, but the gun stayed trained on me. "What company do you work for?" "North Star Security," I replied. I saw the man relax a bit, but mostly I was relieved that he'd lowered the weapon. In the best of times, a gun in any situation is less than ideal. All kinds of accidents can happen. I've seen many innocent bystanders fall victim to trigger-happy situations. The man stepped over to a wooden table and sat down heavily. As I looked around the room, I was surprised at how much it resembled a movie set from an old western, right down to the small oil lanterns on the tables and hanging from the wooden rafters. He beckoned me over, and I sat across from him. "Judging by the welcome, I'm guessing the workers aren't the only ones who are spooked," I said. He looked at the gun, then laid it on the table. He seemed to be in his 40s or 50s, but there was a deep weariness in his eyes. He looked haggard and worn down. "Truth be told, I'm not even sure a gun would do any good," he said quietly. "Maybe you should tell me when the trouble started," I suggested. He looked at me, and I could see worry tugging at the corners of his eyes. "Your contract's open-ended, right?" I nodded. "Which means you have to finish the job or you don't get paid, right?" I nodded again. He looked me over for a long moment, then sat back, drained his glass of amber-colored liquid, and sighed heavily. "I bought this town a while back," he started. "Recently, with the passing of my wife, I decided I needed to throw myself into a project to keep me busy. I wanted to revitalize this town and turn it into a tourist attraction." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said. He nodded in acknowledgement, but never said another word about her. "Things were going along smoothly," he continued. "You see, most of the buildings have been restored. They look good now." "I said you should have seen them when we started," he scoffed. "They were falling apart. No one had lived here for years. That's why I was able to buy the whole place for next to nothing." "I'm thinking that's not the only reason," I replied. Yes, he said, as a haunted look passed through his eyes. We saved the church for last because it needed the most work. But once they started renovating, that's when things began to happen. Things, I queried. It wasn't much at first. Shovels and saws would go missing. Tools would be left in perfect order at night, only to be in complete disarray in the morning. For a while, the workers blamed each other, saying there was a prankster among them. But that wasn't the case. How do you know? I asked. I wish it was that simple, he said. I waited for a long moment for him to continue. We found the first body shortly after that, he said so quietly I barely heard him. A worker? I asked. He nodded. Dead? I continued. He nodded again. Why didn't you stop everything and leave? I asked. Because it was already too late, he said. We had disturbed it. Disturbed what? I followed up. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He shook his head and looked away for a moment. I could swear I saw a tear run down his cheek. I'm sorry, he said, rubbing his palms on his face. Let me take you to your room, and we'll discuss this further in the morning. My curiosity wanted him to finish the story, but it seemed like his weariness had been amplified by the alcohol. I followed him as he carried the lantern up the creaking wooden stairs to the first door and opened it for me. He handed me the light and told me the bathroom was across the hall if I needed it. I'll be here bright and early in the morning to give you the full tour, he said, sounding more like a host than someone dealing with supernatural terror. Aren't you staying here tonight? I asked. His eyes flashed with genuine fear. Not here, he said firmly. I'll be back in the morning. I looked around the comfortable-looking room, trying to decide what was so wrong with it as he stepped toward the door. Oh, by the way, he said, stopping at the doorway, don't bother with your cell phone. There's no signal up here. I glanced at my phone, and when I looked up, he was gone. I picked up the lantern and stepped to the doorway, but I didn't hear him leaving. You would have thought someone walking out on hardwood floors would make some sort of noise, but it was completely silent. The only sound I heard was the rain pelting against the windows. Since I was already in the hallway, I decided to check out the bathroom. I walked a short distance down the hall and found it to be functional and clean, but nothing extraordinary. While I was there, I used the toilet, washed my hands, then went to my room and got my toiletries kit to brush my teeth. Carrying a lantern around was a little disconcerting. I've had to deal without electricity many times before, but that wasn't what was bothering me. The shadows from the lamp danced all over the walls and ceiling, giving the impression of others in the room with me. It's strange because I'd never had that feeling before. Shadows were always just shadows to me. I was trained to be cautious of who could be hiding in the shadows, not to be afraid of the shadows themselves. I finished up my bedtime routine and settled in to sleep. There wasn't much else to do, so I might as well get some rest. One of the things I was taught early on in my career was that any time you get a chance to rest, you take it. You never know when the next opportunity will come. I laid down on the surprisingly comfortable bed and did some relaxation exercises. Before I knew it, I was asleep. I woke up with a start, not knowing why. It was pitch black in the room. Instead of panicking, I touched my watch to illuminate it and found my phone, turning on the flashlight and lighting the lamp. This helped me get my bearings, but it still didn't tell me why I was awake. I sat there for a long moment, then I heard it. There was a loud clanking sound coming from somewhere outside. Sleeping in my clothes while on a job was a habit I'd gotten into when I first started doing private security, another carryover from the military. I slipped out of bed and into my boots, then strapped on my utility belt and checked to make sure my sidearm was loaded. I turned off the phone's flashlight and grabbed a small utility flashlight from one of the pouches on the belt. For the moment, I holstered the gun and explored with the flashlight. This could be nothing. I didn't want to go in guns blazing just to find some kids playing around or a worker who came in early. I double-checked my watch. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. It seemed like an odd time for a worker to come in, but stranger things have happened. Working my way down the stairs quietly, I double-checked the barroom. It was empty. Opening the door, I had the strangest feeling that something was wrong. Nothing seemed to be out of place. It had stopped raining, and I stepped out into the street to find a light layer of fog. Looking up and down the street, I heard the noise again. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the church. Leading with the flashlight, I started in that direction. There seemed to be a slight orange glow coming from inside the building. The closer I got, the more the beam of my flashlight made the air around me glow with the fog. It made me feel like I was giving away my position. I fought back the feeling. This was a small town in Washington, not an active war zone. I had to be cautious, but also temper it with reasonable actions. The church loomed in front of me, and it seemed much larger up close. I climbed the stone steps and reached for the door handle when a loud crack sounded behind me. I whipped around, shining my flashlight at everything, but there was nothing there. As I looked back, I noticed a light in the window of my room at the inn. I must have left the lantern lit. As I watched, I saw the light dim for an instant and then get brighter, almost as if someone had walked in front of it. The temperature felt like it was in the lower 70s, but that didn't keep a chill from running down my spine. Someone was curious to know who I was. From years of experience, I've found that it's never good when someone wants to find out who you are but doesn't want to do it face to face. That would be something to deal with when I got back to my room. For now, there was a church to explore. I got the feeling that someone was trying to distract me from entering the church. I reached the top of the stairs and turned the handle, but nothing happened. It didn't feel like it was locked. It was almost as if someone was on the other side holding the handle. I turned as hard as I could, and finally it gave way. The door opened so suddenly that it dragged me inside and nearly knocked me to the floor. Regaining my balance, my hand hovered over my gun, expecting to see someone doing something they weren't supposed to. As I slowly panned around the room, I found something much worse, absolutely nothing. There was a lit lantern set up on a table near the altar that was in the middle of being restored. Other than that, there were a lot of pews that were halfway constructed. The ones that were finished looked like they'd been sanded and were waiting for a layer of stain. I walked down the center aisle as if looking for a seat at a wedding or a funeral. As I approached the partially reconstructed pulpit, I looked up and saw a life-sized wooden carving of Jesus on the cross. It looked ancient, not like wine that ages well, but like something decrepit and forgotten. It had been painted flesh colors at one time, but now it was cracked and peeling away from the carving. It looked grotesque to see layers of paint peeling away like rotting skin falling off a body. I'm not the most religious man, but I believe in Jesus. I've prayed enough prayers sitting in foxholes and caves, asking to be rescued from bad situations, and I'm still here. I wouldn't call him and me best friends. I know our relationship could be closer, but seeing him depicted that way, rotting to pieces, was just disturbing. As I looked into the carved face, I swore I saw the eyes open for an instant. I blinked my own eyes to be sure I was seeing right, but when I looked again, they were closed. It was my imagination playing tricks on me, at least. That's what I told myself. I stepped onto the platform and looked around. Off to each side were doors. I went to the one on the right and found a small supply closet. The one on the left held a set of stairs that went down and disappeared into darkness. Just inside the door, there was yellow and black caution tape blocking the way down. I shone the light on the stairs, and they looked sturdy enough. I reached for the tape, but before I got hold of it, a strong hand grabbed my shoulder and turned me around. "What do you think you're doing?" said a man who was a full foot shorter than me, but his grip felt like iron. "I was about to go down those stairs," I said. He looked at me with the incredulous look a parent gives a toddler who's reaching for a hot stove. "And you didn't see the caution tape," he said. "I saw it," I replied. "Who are you anyway? I've never seen you before." "I make sure people do what needs to be done," he replied. "So you're the foreman?" I asked. His eyes bled with suspicion as he stared at me. "Where did you say you were from again?" As I was about to answer, more workers entered, followed by the owner I'd met last night. "Let's ask the boss if he knows you," the foreman said smugly. The owner locked eyes with me and gave me the strangest look as he walked up to us. "Good morning," he said, addressing both of us. "Good morning, sir," the foreman said. "I caught this man snooping around in here." "Did you now?" he replied. "Is that true?" "I wasn't snooping. I was investigating," I said. "Don't you remember our conversation last night?" His eyes opened a hair wider for an instant, then went back to normal. "Of course I do," he said with a smile that seemed forced. "Remind me again, my memory isn't the best." "We met in the saloon, talked for a bit, and then you showed me to my room," I said. "Indeed," he said with a raised eyebrow. "Did I say anything else?" "You told me you bought this place after your wife passed away, and problems started after you found the first dead worker." "Dead?" the foreman said with alarm. "When did this happen?" The owner burst into laughter. "It appears Mr." he began, looking at me. "Thompson," I said, filling in the gap. "Mr. Thompson here has pulled a fast one on you," he said to the foreman. "Perhaps he and I should go discuss the matter in private, and you can continue with your work." The owner grabbed my arm and guided me away from the foreman, whose eyes burned as they followed us out the door. We walked out of the church in silence as he nodded to workers who were struggling in to start work for the day. He led me back to the saloon, and we sat at the same table as before. "So you and I met at this saloon last night?" he asked. "At this very table," I said. "I came to the door and you pulled a gun on me." His eyebrows raised. "Did I now? And what time was this?" "I'd say around 9. We sat here and talked about what was going on with the workers." "And what else did I say, other than about the worker?" "I asked why you hadn't left, and you said it was too late." This time he didn't try to hide it. His eyes grew wide, and he stared at me for a long moment, seeming to gather himself. "I apologize, Mr. Thompson, if this all seems a little strange," he said. "You and I did not have a conversation last night." It was my turn to raise my eyebrows. "At 9 o'clock last night, I was in bed with my very much alive wife," he said. "But you said," I began to speak, and we have not had any workers die. I don't understand, I said. Neither do I. I thought about it for a long moment. You were drinking when you talked to me. Is it possible you were too drunk to remember? He leaned a little closer and reached into his pocket, setting a coin on the table. I picked it up and looked at it. It was an Alcoholics Anonymous coin. I haven't had a drink in 19 years, he said, putting the coin back in his pocket. Then who did I talk to last night? I asked. He put the coin back in his pocket. Are you sure it was me who was drinking? I looked up at him and read suspicion in his eyes. I don't drink, I said. He leaned back in his chair. It seems we've reached an impasse, he said. Perhaps I should call your company and have a different person come investigate the matter. I want to find out what's going on here, I said. Perhaps you should give me at least a day to investigate. Unless there's some other reason you don't want me to get to the bottom of this, I added. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Please continue your investigation, Mr. Thompson. Unimpeded, I asked. I will inform the foreman to allow you free rein. Thank you, I said, standing to leave. Just one more thing, he said. What was the last part of what my doppelganger told you? You said it was too late to leave because you had disturbed something. His eyes fell to the table as if deep in thought. I went back to the church and began talking to the workers one by one. Each of them was hesitant to talk around the foreman, but once they were out of earshot, they told very similar stories. There had been strange things going on, especially at night. It was more than just tools being moved around. Strange symbols would appear carved into the wood they were using. The owner would tell them to cut the symbols out and use whatever they could of the wood. One of the workers had gone missing, but after a day or so, the owner said he had quit. The strange thing was, no one was able to contact him after that. The more I dug, the more I found. Some of the workers had become curious as to why they were restoring this town in the middle of nowhere. It turned out it had long been suspected that satanic rituals were being carried out in this very church. It was also suspected to be the site of one of the earliest witch burnings in the Pacific Northwest. But the two facts that stuck out in my mind were: no one hung around after dark. That was when things were alleged to get strange. And no one was allowed down the steps I had found before the foreman stopped me. The workers had been told the steps were unsafe and could collapse under the weight of a person. It didn't take much convincing to keep them away from those creepy stairs. By afternoon, I knew exactly what my next move was. I went back to my room and checked around to see if anything was missing. Nothing seemed to be disturbed, so I set my watch alarm and took a nap. The alarm went off at 9 o'clock. I went to the bathroom to splash some water on my face, then geared up for my expedition. When I got to the church, it was empty. I made a beeline for the left door and the creepy staircase. With flashlights attached to a headband and my waistband, I was good to go. I needed to keep my hands free for whatever I might need them for. I attached a safety rope like mountain climbers use and found a sturdy spot to anchor it into the wall. If the stairs gave out on me, at least I wouldn't fall to my death. As expected, every stair creaked like it was about to give out, but thankfully, none of them did. The trip down was an assault on the senses. The damp, musty smell of rotting wood and general decay was nearly overwhelming. I was surprised at the general lack of cobwebs. It told me this area wasn't quite as off-limits as some had led me to believe. Surprisingly, the bottom didn't open up into a full basement. There were a few wooden shelves at the base of the stairs, but they were empty. Instead, it became a narrow passageway. The floor was made of packed dirt, and the walls were the same stone the foundation of the church was made from. It seemed whoever had built this tunnel had built it at the same time as the church. The ceiling barely made it to 6 feet. I had to duck to keep from brushing my head against it. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but this was the key to discovering what was happening here. I'd been walking for 10 minutes, senses alert, hand on my holstered sidearm, when suddenly the air changed. The smell became more pungent, and the air felt warmer. It was a feeling of closing in that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I turned a corner, and the tunnel opened up into a large room with a high ceiling. I panned around, trying to get the scope of the room, when my light fell on something massive in the corner. It looked like a huge black boulder made of leather. Watching transfixed, I noticed it was moving not much, but just a bit of rising and falling. I realized it was breathing. Fear gripped me like a cold hand around my throat. I no longer had any interest in finding out what was going on here. I just wanted to turn and slowly back away. The thing made a noise. It was either a snort or a cough, but in either case, it seemed to be waking up. I doused my lights and stayed as still as possible while listening in the total darkness. Its breathing became louder and less steady. I heard a creaking that sounded like bones when someone stretched. It was getting up, and I was standing in the middle of the tunnel. If by some miracle it didn't already know I was here, as soon as it walked over here, it would run right into me. My mind raced to come up with options as I heard footsteps coming closer. I backed up against the wall and started edging to the left, hoping I was in the main room and not still in the tunnel. The footsteps were so close when they suddenly stopped. The absence of sound was deafening. I tried to hold my breath as I listened for the beast's breathing. It was slow and sporadic, as if it was listening for me. Neither of us moved. We barely breathed, each waiting for the other to reveal their location. My hand drifted to the gun as I tried to pull it out of the holster as quietly as possible. The air shifted. The beast had moved, but I didn't know where. I heard a strange squelching sound and then a voice that chilled me to the bone. "What are you doing, Mr. Thompson?" I tried to hold off as long as possible, but curiosity got the best of me. I turned on my headlamp to find the owner standing right in front of me, staring at me with a maddening smile. My eyes darted around, looking for the beast, but I knew I wouldn't find it. It was standing in front of me. "So are you the real thing?" I said, hoping to keep the panic out of my voice. "Or are you some shapeshifter who pretends to be someone else because he has no identity of his own?" "I am whoever I want to be," he said. I heard the squelching again, only this time I had the displeasure of watching it happen. His entire body rippled and tore itself apart, only to reform into the beast for a moment, then tear apart again and reform into something much more terrifying. I gasped, looking into my own eyes. "You see," he said in my voice, "I can take your place and travel around pretending to solve problems." While he was changing, I glanced around to see if there was anything else in the room I could use. In the far corner, I saw what looked like a nest and an inverted cross hanging on the wall. "If you could, why haven't you?" I said, playing a hunch. "What?" he asked. "If you were free to go anywhere, then why haven't you?" "Why sit here in the middle of the woods with nothing to do?" "I chose to stay here," he said in my voice. You chose to stay because this is where your power is, I said. You know little. I'm rebuilding this place so my worshippers can live here and pray to me, giving me all the power I need. Just like when this place was first built, and until my followers thrive, I survive off of human sacrifice. So you did kill the worker, I said, and no one remembers him, just like they won't remember you. He grinned and took a step toward me, but I drew my pistol and shot him in the forehead. He fell to the ground, bleeding. It was a strange sight to see myself die, but then the squelching began again, and he reformed into his demonic form. He stood 10 feet tall and was covered in leathery skin that looked like tiny teeth. His face was a nightmare of glowing red eyes and massive sharp teeth. He roared at me in what sounded like 1,000 voices. I turned and ran down the tunnel, ducking so I didn't hit my head and knock myself out. That would have ended my escape and my life. I heard the squelching again and heard my voice call after me. You can't escape, and besides, I know how to find you. I turned and fired, hitting him in the chest. He dropped and squelched again. I wanted to watch him turn into his demonic form to see him squeezed into the tunnel that was too small for him. But I didn't dare waste this time on anything but escape. It seemed like forever until I came to the stairs. I took them 2 at a time. Once I reached the top, I turned to see him at the bottom. I shot again, then found a lantern inside the church, lit it, and tossed it down the stairs. The glass shattered, spreading fire all over the bottom stairs. They began to burn almost immediately. I could hear his desperate cries as the flames crawled up the stairs, destroying them one by one. Turning and running out the doors, I didn't bother with my things in my room. I hopped in my car and drove like a bat out of hell. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I glanced in my rearview mirror, hoping I wouldn't see that thing chasing me. Instead, I saw a glow growing in the forest behind me. I prayed the whole church was on fire and that it would spread to all the houses. I only wished his followers were in the houses when they burned. I wondered how many more places there were like this in the world, hiding in plain sight. I never paid much attention to that phrase before I started my new job. I could not find the key to the basement, no matter where I looked in the bedroom. I don't remember misplacing it, but with everything that's happened in the past 12 hours or so, I wasn't about to question something as mundane as this. Afraid to go too far without Marcus, I decided to wait by the ladder up to the attic for him to finish searching and maybe join him if he found something. But when I stopped to listen, I could hear no footsteps or any noise coming from up there. Marcus, I called while looking up at the darkness above me, seeing no ray of light from his flashlight either. But I heard him speak to me, and I figured he must be quite far inside. I'm up here, his voice was flat, and it just sounded strange, not quite like him. But I chalked it up to the way sound carried itself from above to the hallway. Come up, he said. I found something. What's up? I asked, starting to climb the ladder, but didn't get the answer I expected. Actually, I got no answer at all. Marcus, I called again with my head now poking up into the attic, and I finished ascending. I cleared my hands of the dust and shivered from how cold it was up here, then looked around and found myself in the dark, with no light coming from anywhere. Something felt wrong, and I wasn't sure if the chill that ran through my body was from the cold or my intuition. I didn't wait around to find out and quickly climbed back down into the hallway, where the cold of the attic followed me It was strange, to say the least. It wasn't like that before I'd gone up there. I waited for a little while, wondering what had caused Marcus to behave so unlike himself. The cold was too much, and I began feeling uncomfortable. So while waiting for him, I decided I'd go back into the bedroom to grab a jacket. But upon opening the door, I was greeted to my living room. I don't think I need to describe to you how I felt at that moment, but I began growing more and more concerned as I wandered from room to room, and found myself in an impossible loop of my own home, to which I was now like a mouse in a trap. Occasionally, after going through each room so many times, I could hear sounds that didn't seem to fit, and objects were defying reality itself. Windows had been placed on ceilings looking into nothing, furniture floating in the middle of the air or clipping into the floor. A reality show playing in the middle of my kitchen where there was no TV. To say the least, I was terrified and convinced I would never make it out of here, as everything only seemed to get worse and only that much more confusing. No matter how much time I spent looking in each room I'd move to next, I would find nothing that even hinted at a way of getting out of this maze. Adrenaline flooded my body in the middle of my search of the kitchen when I heard footsteps and increasingly louder static mixed with a voice constantly changing its pitch, but not in a regular way. Rather, this voice was constantly swapping between male and female. There was nowhere in the kitchen to hide, so the only thing I could do was hide behind the counter on the other side and stay as silent as I could be, considering the circumstances. I covered my mouth and still feared the sound of my heart pounding would be enough to give me away. The three sounds moved closer and closer together and eventually reached the kitchen. The footsteps came to a stop, but what I was hearing disturbed me in a way nothing had been able to in all of my time alive. What I heard, presumably coming from the entrance to the kitchen, was, like I said, a voice swapping between that of a man and a woman, mixed in with radio static, citing yesterday's news and the weather report, random conversations, and then something all too familiar. 911, what's your emergency? It was my voice. My breathing froze, and I slowly looked up without revealing myself from the counter, expecting whatever was here in the kitchen with me to be looking down like in a horror movie. But thankfully, there was nothing there. The voice continued swapping between the voices of two other men, mine, and out of nowhere, Marcus's. Jessica, since when are your eyes two different colors? I widened my eyes in disbelief and covered my mouth with both hands, praying whatever this was would leave. The static grew louder first, and then began stopping and starting again at random intervals, while this thing continued repeating the same phrases over and over. It was sickening to listen to. Jessica, since when are your eyes two different colors? Jessica, since when are your eyes two different colors? By now, the voices had stopped swapping, and only Marcus's was the one repeating this. Then, just as suddenly as it arrived, the footsteps began walking in the opposite direction, and the phrase faded into the otherwise silent house. I was so petrified by what had just happened, I couldn't bring myself to get up for another few minutes, and had to keep myself from crying. After spending enough time with just myself and no inexplicable sounds showing up, I stood upright again and looked around to find that I was alone. It finally dawned on me that because of the state of panic I was in, I had completely forgotten the most obvious part of the kitchen: the window that the intruder broke to get inside. It was still shattered, But unlike most of the other windows that looked into nothing or just walls, beyond it was my bedroom and the sight of a body on the ground that I couldn't recognize. I gasped when I saw it, then noticed that it was lying in a pool of blood. I crawled through the window and approached it slowly. Being able to get closer to it allowed me to see that its clothes, though torn and bloody, were the same ones as the man who had broken my window was wearing. The realization made me stop in my tracks for a moment before resuming my crawl toward him. It was a man whose face I could not yet see. It was turned away from me, and the hood of the gray hoodie, or what remained of it, was still up. There must have been some kind of fight with someone or something, because over his legs was my bedside table with the lamp broken on the ground, glass scattered all around. Carefully kneeling down as to not cut myself, I turned the man's head toward me, revealing the wide-eyed, bloodied face of someone I knew all too well. Lying before me, dead on the ground after breaking into my home, was my ex-husband, David. I never talked about David much to anyone after we finalized our divorce. I had long since been emotionally detached from him after 2 years of growing neglect that made us argue more and more every day, and we would end up not talking to each other for weeks after some of the fights. Everything started as what I first thought was a way for him to try and scare me, as he knew I'd always been afraid of anything horror-related. So he found it funny to occasionally read out a scary story or pop out of a corner to see my reaction. I never paid him much mind and only laughed it off when he started talking about the other side and the mirror people. But he kept getting more and more interested in it until that was everything he would talk about, from day to night, sometimes not even sleeping to continue what he called his research, and what I found to be mindless scrolling on the internet and reading made-up articles about some made-up thing to scare teenagers and gullible minds. Now, after everything I'd seen and gone through, I remembered all of it for the first time in the few months I'd been trying to bury it in my mind. I don't know what he was doing here, why he was trying to break into my home, and how he ended up like this. So many thoughts flooded through my head instantly, most of them grief and confusion. But I had no time to process any of them as I jumped back at the sight, and a piece of glass pierced through my right palm, and I let out an involuntary yelp. Just as I did that, I immediately heard the same sounds from earlier footsteps and voices with static mixed in, repeating random words and phrases. But this time, there was more than one, and they were coming right toward me. I turned to my bed and rushed to hide under it, having no time to get to the wardrobe or try and make my way back through the window and into the kitchen. The covers were hanging loosely and covered half the space below the bed, so if I stayed quiet, I'd have a chance to go unnoticed. The eerie sights kept coming. Rushing into my bedroom were 3 men, 2 in police uniforms whose movements were unnaturally stiff and their faces expressionless, their eyes not even moving, and the third one was not Marcus. I mean, it looked like him. It had his face, but it was changing expressions every second from a smile to nothing to a grimace to sadness to every single emotion you can think of. His clothes were the ones I'd seen him in when he changed after we went to his house, only their colors were changing rapidly. Then, in the blink of an eye, he was wearing a suit again, the colors changing and mixing. What terrified me the most about the view were his limbs. Like I mentioned, the policemen were totally still and unmoving, but this Marcus lookalike's limbs were spasming and flying around in movements that the human body simply couldn't perform. One moment his arms were by his side, and the next they were raised backwards 90 degrees. Instantly afterward, they were pointing forward, then clipping into his body before returning to normal again. His head snapped violently from side to side, as if his neck were constantly breaking and repairing itself. Their presence brought with them the static, but once they'd entered the room, the voices had stopped, and they just sat there for about half a minute before the static began ringing so loud I almost had to cover my ears. Then the three just disappeared. They were gone as if they'd never been there. I waited to see if anything would return again, or if I'd hear any noises. But the only thing was total silence, and the body of my ex-husband uncomfortably close to me while I was hiding. I crawled out from under the bed and took one more look at him before quickly jumping through the window into the kitchen again. Only this time, it led back to the hallway with the attic. There was sure to be some emotional fallout from this, but my brain wasn't letting me process it now. Before I could even look around, I was tackled by something into the wall, and my mouth was covered, preventing me from screaming no matter how hard I tried. I started throwing my hands erratically at this thing, trying to hit it and make it release me. But it only began shushing me and reduced the strength of its grip. I opened my eyes to see Marcus, bruised and disheveled, his clothes dirty and stained with blood. He stared at me and spoke. "Blue eyes," he said, then looked at my bloody hand and let me go before pressing a finger to his lips, telling me to stay silent. Seeing him so beat up while the rest of those things looked, well, completely abnormal and impossible to even exist. And considering the fact that if he wasn't the actual Marcus and wanted to harm me, he had the opportunity, but didn't. "Marcus," I whispered and eyed him up and down. He really had it rough somewhere. "Is it you, the real you?" "Yes, yes. Quiet, Jessica. Something's here. It's not human." Marcus was more afraid than I'd ever seen him, and he gave the impression of someone who wasn't easy to scare. "We need to find a way out," he said. "How did you end up here from the attic?" I asked. "Yeah, the first time." "The first time?" I questioned. After making sure we heard none of those things approaching and looking through the window and each of the doors. Marcus and I sat in the middle of the hallway, where he had explained to me how he'd been attacked by something after finding the intruder, and was thrown back into what we assumed was reality, where I found him, and we drove back to the hotel. That's when he'd seen that my eyes were different colors, and bringing it up caused this other Jessica to begin distorting her limbs just like I'd seen the other Marcus do. Her head had started to twitch before he could get out of the car. She lunged at him from the driver's seat, and he woke up again in the middle of the living room. We were able to mutually shock each other, him with his experience and me with the fact that this intruder was my ex-husband. "So why did he try to break into your home? Does he hate you? Did he want to hurt you?" "No, it was obvious to me he still loved me, even after all the arguments and the divorce. I was the one that ended things, but he'd spoken about the other side and mirror people. That's what he called them." I blinked and moved my eyes from staring into the wall. That was not the right color to look at Marcus. "I think he knew something about this and was trying to warn me," I said. We sat in thought for a little while longer before he got up and helped me off the floor. "We have to find a way out fast, Jessica. The door we went through led us into my bathroom, or this place's version of it. It looked exactly like it normally does, which was unusual, aside from one thing. And that was the mirror, which did not have its usual reflective surface, but was instead looking into another bathroom. We looked around thoroughly first before I helped Marcus climb up onto the sink, and he crawled through. The second he did, however, he disappeared, and I was left all alone again, afraid to turn back and unsure of what else to do. I started making my way onto the sink with one leg, and through the mirror with the rest of my body. Halfway through, I turned in reaction to hearing an ear-piercing scream coming from a woman mixed with the undertone of a male voice, and that damned static. Charging through the door of the bathroom, and right at me, was me, the other Jessica. Her eyes were wide, and her mouth was open as far as it could humanly go. She grabbed me by the ankle and began pulling me back in. I held on to the edges and screamed, using my other leg to kick at her hands. But she would not let go, only intensifying those inhuman screams that will forever haunt my nightmares. Despite that, I continued trying while looking around to see if there was anything on the sink that might help me. I saw the glass cup that I used to keep my toothbrush in. I grabbed it and used all my strength to slam it into the other Jessica's head, shattering it. A final kick into her face was enough to force her to release me, and I made the rest of my way through the mirror. Her screams stopped as if I had just woken up from a dream. I dropped onto the floor with a loud thud, immediately pushing myself back up against the wall and hyperventilating, while Marcus looked at me, unsure of what to do. What happened? Why did it take you so long? He knelt by my side and winced in pain, putting his left hand over his ribs. The other me, she damn near dragged me back in, I responded. Well, you don't have to worry about that. I think we found the way out, he said. Look. Marcus pointed to the mirror. After my breathing slowly started getting back to normal, I only saw pitch black in it. Looks like we found the way out, he said. How do you know we're out? I asked him. Listen the noises outside. Hear those construction workers, the cars. I nodded and took in the sounds he was describing. I don't know if you noticed, but there's none of that in there. I stood up and approached it, not daring to put my hand through, but stared into the black void. I would describe what I was seeing as impossible, but considering everything that had gone down just now, I don't think that word has any meaning anymore. We need to get out of this house before we get trapped again. Is your car still outside? I asked as I opened the door leading out into the hallway, making sure to check beforehand. The house looked completely normal, no distortions anywhere. No, I don't know where it is. Maybe still at the hotel, or honestly, I have no idea. I just showed up here again after being attacked by whatever that thing pretending to be you was. My car was at the hotel also. At least that's where I left it after ending my shift early following that call. So we decided to call a taxi to get us to Marcus's house, where we could both take a break and get fixed up, hopefully without having to worry about being pulled into another dimension, or whatever the place we were trapped in was. After I took a shower, Marcus went to rest and make sure he had no wounds he was missing, and I'd wrapped my hand in bandages before using his laptop, with his permission, of course, to do some research on what David had been so obsessed with all that time ago. The weight of finding the man I'd spent so much time in love with dead, in a place that couldn't exist, still hadn't come down on me. But at least it allowed me to remain focused. Looking up mirror people and other side together yielded scattered and terribly written posts with grammar and spelling mistakes. packed with action scenes that were obviously works of fiction by people who'd stumbled upon something similar online. But one of the top results was an actually well-put-together website describing these entities as another phenomenon, documenting reports of people seeing, hearing, talking, and even interacting with themselves. But by the time it had reached that point, no more updates had been posted. I showed the website to Marcus, and he browsed through it, finding something I hadn't looked for yet. At the bottom corner of the page, it was the creator of the website's name, a middle-aged woman by the name of Dr. Patricia Wilson, and contact information, with her email encouraging people who have an experience to share to contact her. We have nothing to lose, right? I mean, this all sounds completely insane and psychotic, but we just went through it, and this woman is probably the only person ready to believe us right off the bat. Marcus looked at me again, but suddenly his eyes trailed toward my injured hand. "Sure, are you going to write the email or should I?" Marcus didn't reply. He seemed zoned out. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Jessica, what's happening to your hand?" I looked at my injured hand and gasped, then quickly lifted up the leg of my pants to see the same thing on my ankle. At the same time, Marcus lifted one side of his shirt enough to see where he'd been attacked. My hand, ankle, and that part of Marcus's torso were pitch black. An excruciatingly long day full of fear and anxiety passed before we heard back from Dr. Wilson. She had messaged us asking to meet in person after we described our situation in detail, but warned us in advance that she doesn't know how helpful she would be. The drive to the address she had given us was about an hour and a half away in Austin, where she had a small apartment she was staying at currently. Marcus and I walked to the hotel to find my car still there, but his had disappeared. We kept a close eye on our wounds or bruises, unsure of what they actually were and if they could spread. We were relieved to see they still hadn't. I'd like to say we discussed theories and possible reasons for why this was happening and why to us. But we were so afraid and exhausted by now that we barely said anything to each other. I'd spoken to my family on the phone earlier and had to pretend everything was okay when deep down, I wanted to cry into the receiver to my mother and ask her what to do. Anything we tried to find regarding the missing police officers who responded to the call that night online was met with old articles that coincidentally had some of the same keywords I'd used in my search. There was nothing on the news either. It was as if nothing had happened at all. We arrived in Austin a little after noon and turned from the main street into another narrow road that led to Dr. Wilson's neighborhood. We climbed up to the 3rd floor and rang her bell. Footsteps approached the door a few moments later and stopped, presumably looking through the peephole before she opened the door to greet us. What we saw in person was a woman slightly older than the one on the website, so I assumed the photo must have been taken some years ago. "Good afternoon. I assume you're Jessica and Marcus," she said, pushing the door open fully now and looking at me first, then at him. "Yes, thank you for having us, Dr. Wilson. We're not sure who we can even turn to about this." Marcus nodded and then brought his head down slightly, as if admitting defeat. "Nobody, I hate to tell you. You're not the first to come to me about something like this, but you are probably the only ones to have." She seemed hesitant to finish her sentence, but did so after a brief pause. "Survived." Marcus and I turned to meet each other's eyes, and Dr. Wilson invited us in, apologizing for saying what she did. and then shut the door behind us once we'd entered. She went to make us coffee while we took our shoes and jackets off and made ourselves comfortable in her living room. I tried taking some of the stress off by petting her puppy, a French bulldog that couldn't have been older than a few months. They allow pets in the building. I tried initiating small talk when she came back to set a friendlier tone before we got to what we were really here for. You can say that. Honestly, the owner is against animals of any kind in the apartment, but I convinced him how little trouble Buster would cause, and that if he broke or damaged anything, I'd pay back in full. Isn't that right, Buster? In response, Buster mustered up a semi-bark and licked her hand as she went to pet his head, and then sat down on the opposite side of the sofa Marcus and I were on a small cushioned chair. I know who you are, Jessica, I must admit. That phrase almost sent me into fight or flight mode, considering I've been on edge, to say the least, for the past 2 days, and was ready to jump up and run out of the apartment. But she continued just in time to allow me to prevent myself from doing so. Your husband contacted me a year ago, trying to find out more about the mirror realm and the creatures inhabiting it. I'm sorry to hear what happened, and that you had to relive it by writing it in the email. Her mentioning my ex-husband's death was a gut punch, as I still hadn't even started processing it over the weight of everything that's happened, and I stared blankly at her. Marcus noticed and took over the conversation for me. Did he mention anything we might need to know? Why was he trying to break into Jessica's home? Dr. Wilson took a sip from her coffee, which still had steam coming off of it, and switched her gaze to me, picking up Buster off the floor once he jumped off. As soon as I stopped petting him, he was obviously completely disinterested in me now, and she sat him in her lap. Because he was afraid of exactly what is happening to you. I can't put this any other way, so I will be forward about it. David did not seem exactly in his right mind even back then. He was talking about all kinds of theories and supposed discoveries he'd made that sounded like the ravings of a madman. But what was evident to me was his duty to protect you from it, Jessica. I assume that's why he was there that night. But he was unlucky enough to encounter something that only appeared to be you. Both Marcus and I were at a loss for words at how casually this woman seemed to be talking about this, as if it was an everyday occurrence that some body snatchers who apparently lived in your damn mirror or something like that took over your life and pretended to be you. But that didn't stop her from continuing. Admittedly, though, he was one of the few to have actually come to me with more than just claims of there being another version of them. So what the hell are these things? Why are they targeting us? Marcus asked, not even having touched his coffee yet, and neither did I. I don't know for sure how they choose their hosts, as I call them, but from what David and others before and after him have told me is that they form when you feel lost for an extended period of time in your life, like when a piece of you seems to be missing. Is that description accurate for you after your divorce, Jessica? Part of me was getting more and more furious at how confidently this woman was trying to gauge the low points in my life. But I could not bring myself to go against her when everything she'd been saying so far was correct. And it didn't help that she sounded so confident. Well, maybe it does, and I guess the same goes for David. He started talking about all this a month after his father passed in a tragic work accident. I thought he was just taking the loss really badly, but my God. I took a moment to think everything through and allowed myself to finally take a sip from the coffee Dr. Wilson had made me before continuing. You said he made some kind of discovery when he'd come to you. What were you talking about? Well, I don't know if your husband had ever come in contact with any of them, but according to him, the only way to sever these beings' connection to you was to destroy them in their own world. I'll be honest that I was, up until very recently, skeptical about its existence as a whole, considering no one had ever actually been to it, or at least done that, and returned to tell the tale. But here you two are, and you have evidence. She held her hand up to her rib cage while also looking at my ankle, referring to the dark marks Marcus and I had. I'm sure he felt as unnerved as I did at the mention of them. And what do these markings mean? Do you know? Marcus joined in. My theory is that it's this other reality's way to manifest itself into our own. I can't tell you what that means or how dangerous it may be, but I hope nobody has to find out. She put Buster back on the ground, and he tried to get her attention again by scratching on her left leg for a second, before making a sound like an angry toddler, and then curling up by her feet. Dr. Wilson then leaned on her knees, and her eyes darted from Marcus's to mine and back. I know that this will sound like suicide, but you were already there once. You twice even, Marcus, and you both managed to escape. In all my time following this phenomenon, I've not heard of or met with anyone to have done that. I'd say that it's your decision if you wanted to do this, but with those marks you have, I'm not sure if you have any choice in the matter if you want to stay you. You must go back and destroy your imposters before they claim you. I don't have to explain how hard my stomach dropped, as we were literally instructed to go back into that damned maze that took the form of my home. But at the same time, there was no other solution we could think of, and I'm sure it had been floating around Marcus's head as much as it had been in mine recently. But how do we even go about doing it? We don't know what they even are. How are we supposed to fight them? My voice trembled at the mention of the confrontation with them. We don't call them mirror people just because we came up with it randomly, Jessica. You came out of that world through your mirror. You see how they're trying to become you slowly. Dr. Wilson stood up and walked over to one of the walls of the apartment that had a large rectangular mirror on it. My guess is that attacking them with glass will be effective in hurting and potentially killing them. Your guess? Marcus stood up, and I felt the disbelief in his words as if they were my own. You're telling us to enter whatever that place is again, most likely walking straight to our death, or God knows, maybe something even worse, and all you have to go off of is your guess. She turned back to face him, seemingly unaffected by his demeanor, and crossed her arms before speaking. Like I said, I've never encountered one of them myself, and I'm only going off what I've heard by people I've spoken to, both in person and through my forum. If it makes you feel better, I'm more than willing to come with you. I've been investigating this for far too long, and I want to be able to help others in your situation if they ever come to find me. So you're saying this isn't just happening to me. It's a whole phenomenon. When was the first time something like this happened? I can't tell you for sure, Jessica. Dr. Wilson shrugged and now turned her whole body to face us. Marcus shook his head while sitting down but remained silent. But you are not the only one being haunted by yourself. You might realize now, though, why it's not a widespread threat. People who look for help from those not familiar with it end up ostracized or thrown in mental hospitals. We stayed at Dr. Wilson's apartment for another half hour, going through Marcus's and my experience in the mirror world, and then getting ready to leave and drive back to my house. It sounds just as insane as it did then, typing this out. When our conversation on the drive back, with Marcus in the driver's seat this time, was mostly filler or silence. As much as I didn't want to admit it because she was still helping us, Dr. Wilson was not a great person to be around, and I can see why she'd be doing something so out of the ordinary, considering how apathetic she seemed to people's emotions. The second thing I was looking forward to the most, after freeing myself of the other me's torment, was not having to spend another second with her. After she gave us some more information and theories about what we have to do, we came to the conclusion that we had to get rid of mine and Marcus's double in order to sever our link to this other reality or dimension, or however you want to call it. We decided that we would do our best to destroy those of the two policemen who disappeared in response to the call, if we found them. And I'm sorry if this makes me sound like a bad person, but I was not ready to spend more time in that hell of a place trying to save someone I didn't know. I just wanted it to be over already. And I think Dr. Wilson was the only one who, despite all her supposed experience, failed to realize that we were literally about to enter another dimension to fight beings that were nothing close to human, when she urged us to make it our goal to find them as well. Arriving at my driveway was just as chilling as before, the eeriness amplified by the police car still outside. On our way, we passed by a store to buy a medium-sized mirror that we broke in order to arm ourselves with shards of glass, an idea suggested by Dr. Wilson that I wasn't sure how it made me feel when you take into account the superstitions about the bad luck that will follow you when you break a mirror. She seemed to not care and was more than happy to shatter it without a second thought. Of course, getting herself the longest and sharpest piece she could find and leaving us with the shorter ones. We explained to Dr. Wilson that going up into the attic is what sent both Marcus and I into the other world, and he was the first to go up the ladder, then Dr. Wilson, and finally myself. All three of us commented on the sudden chill and cold of the attic, and then slowly descended back into the hallway to find nothing out of the ordinary until the first time a room repeated. But what was stranger than usual was how the distortions appeared almost instantaneously, floating or half-missing furniture, misplaced windows, and the like. I can't believe I'm actually seeing this myself for a change, Dr. Wilson said this time, sounding like the one completely lost in the situation. I don't know about Marcus, but it made me feel more in control, like I knew what to expect. Of course, I didn't. Okay, listen to me. I tried to sound as confident as I could to grab their attention. I have an idea. We can walk all we want and expect to find one of those things, or we can draw them to us. While I was here, when I made a noise, they came almost instantly. So let's devise a plan. I looked around the room we were currently in. It was the kitchen, a perfect place for an ambush. I'd stay behind the counter by the window, looking toward the doorway, on either side of which Marcus and Dr. Wilson would wait with glass shards in hand to stab them into whichever creature came first. They agreed to the plan and took their positions while I looked into one of the shelves floating in the middle of the air, inside of which were small glass cups, not bothering to obey the laws of physics. Looking back at the others and raising the cup in the air, they nodded in approval, and I took a deep breath and braced myself, squeezing my shard in the other hand. Before I dropped the glass, I looked at the mark on my hand, which seemed to have grown, almost consuming my entire palm. We had to get this done, or who knows what would follow us. I simulated a pained yell as I threw the glass onto the ground. And seconds later, the all too familiar static and distant voices started storming toward the kitchen from the other room. Turning the corner was a man in a police uniform. I assumed one of the two that were unlucky enough to be sent as the responders the night I got the call. It took all the strength in me not to flinch, as it's what were, up until now, stiff movements turned into a feral sprint, accompanied by a reverberating, inhuman growl. The moment that thing appeared through the doorway, Marcus and Dr. Wilson were swift to stab their shards into its body. Marcus managed to slice into its abdomen, while Dr. Wilson jammed her straight into its right eye. Moments later, the awful sound it somehow produced was cut like a TV turning off, and it began crackling until eventually shattering into pieces that littered the floor. The three of us looked at each other in disbelief. We had just killed one of those things, and without it even being able to reach us. For the first time, I felt strong, triumphant, like I was going to be the one that they should be afraid of. That was short-lived. The only form of celebration we were able to have was momentary looks of widened eyes and smiles before the sounds returned, the footsteps, the screaming, the static. So many sets of footsteps, so much static. Dr. Wilson gasped, and Marcus held his free hand up to his ear and shut his eyes tight while I backed away from the counter. In that moment of fear, I forgot about the broken window. Before I could see what was about to come through the door, I was pulled back by my hair so hard that for a second, I thought my scalp was about to rip. I could only keep myself on my feet for less than 2 seconds, calling out for help, before my spine slammed against the bottom frame of the window, and I went limp just long enough to be pulled into the bedroom it was looking into and thrown across half its length, rolling across the floor. I could hear the commotion in the kitchen the whole time. Dr. Wilson screamed while Marcus was silent, but I could hear objects being thrown into the walls and an occasional grunt that I assumed came from him. I did my best to stand up as quickly as possible, and that's when I realized my glass shard was gone. I likely dropped it when I was grabbed. I opened my eyes to instantly be met with the sight of the other Jessica, standing a few feet away from me, with her mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing her entire bottom row of teeth, but no tongue, and her eyes 2 different colors, just like Marcus had told me. She produced the same horrifying scream, but it wasn't mixed with any static. It sounded exactly like me, but as if I was being brutally torn apart, like I was being tortured in the most awful way possible. Looking around the bedroom, I realized there was nothing I could use as a weapon. By the time I did, the other Jessica had started her charge at me again, and I screamed, barely managing to slip past her and throw myself onto the bed. I reached for the pillow and threw horrified, panicked inhales and exhales, threw it at her, which, as you may imagine, was not a very effective weapon. I crawled back, gasping as I fell over the other side, standing up as fast as I could. I was met with the awful sight of her crawling onto the bed like a spider. But that was not what disturbed me the most. Her head mouth still hanging open so painfully, and eyes empty like a dark abyss. Her head was throwing itself into impossible angles, just like that thing pretending to be Marcus had been doing while I was hiding. I tried to make my way to the other corner of the room, but she pounced on me, pinning me to the ground. With inhuman strength, she took me by the neck and lifted me up, slamming me into the wall. As I looked into her face, parts of her skin started going black while I was still struggling. I heard the sound of glass shattering through the window, and the chair suddenly hit my double, and it released its grip on me. That moment allowed me to look into the kitchen and see Marcus being tackled by his double and disappearing out of sight. And Dr. Wilson was held against the wall by another creature in the skin of a police officer. But her hand was raised, and she was holding her glass shard still. All she had to do was drive it into its head, and she would have freed herself. But that thing was too fast and stopped her arm midair with its own, squeezing so hard it caused her to drop the shard and scream in pain. All of this happening in less than a second, and then it dropped her arm and put its palm against her mouth. What I witnessed after that was the total disappearance of that thing's everything. It was just a totally black silhouette that resembled a human with impossibly uneven proportions, constantly swapping. But the only thing that stayed consistent was the arm with which it held onto Dr. Wilson's mouth. Its palm then moved from just covering her mouth to grabbing her entire head. And she let out a guttural scream that only got louder and louder as it tightened its grip. I couldn't see anything more as I still had the other me to deal with. While looking into the kitchen, an idea came to me. I could lure this Jessica toward the window and use its pieces of glass to shatter her. And that is what I did. I sprinted as fast as I could to the window and turned back to see she was already running for me. Her hands were out, trying to grab me, and I ducked right before she was able to, and I moved to the right, causing her to ram in front of the window and into its frame. It was now or never. I turned around and gathered all the strength I had left to grab the other Jessica's head and slam it into the sharp piece of glass pointing right up. She was able to release one final shriek before it pierced into her left eye, and she stood there, frozen and silent. At that moment, I looked up to see what was happening inside the kitchen, and saw that Dr. Wilson had completely disappeared, while Marcus was still in the tussle with his double. I was just about to crawl through the window to help, before I was forced down onto the floor by an awful, throbbing pain in my ankle, hand, and now neck, where the other Jessica had held me up. But the pain was soon to disappear, and I looked back up toward the window where my double was beginning to crack. I called out for Marcus one last time before she turned to pieces, and my memories end there. What I remember immediately after was waking up in the hospital bed with an IV going into my left hand, and I was covered by a sheet. I was so exhausted, I could barely produce any sound that alerted the visitor I did not know I had, sitting on a chair by the bed. "Easy, Jessica," the voice was that of a woman, and it would certainly have made me scream if I had the strength for it. "You've been out the longest out of the three of us." I slowly turned my head to see Dr. Wilson smiling at me with this expression that had something off about it. But I chalked it up to my condition. "Dr. Wilson, what happened?" I asked. "We did what we had to do is what happened, but you were completely out of it when we came out." I was too worried about Marcus to ask what she meant by came out. "Where's Marcus? Is he okay?" I asked. "Oh yes, dear, don't worry about him. He's in a neighboring room. You two had a real struggle in there." She then stood up, and at that moment, I could not remember how she had suddenly disappeared while we were in that place. She made her way to the door and opened it, stepping out and saying, "You'll have to ask the nurses if you can see him, though." "Wait, Dr. Wilson," I called out weakly. "How did we get out? Is it over?" "I'll tell you later, Jessica. Visiting time is over, and I need to feed Toby. You know he's probably starving by now. You know how much French bulldogs eat." Before I could question her more, she shut the door, and I was left alone for the first time, completely alone, and separated from Marcus, since he offered me his help. I was afraid for him, and I wanted to see him. But at least I had Dr. Wilson's word that he was okay. I moved the covers to look at my hand and ankle. The parts where I'd been marked were covered in bandages, and I had no idea what was under there. When I ran my other hand over the front of my neck, I confirmed that the case was the same with it too. I was sure that if they'd remained like that, I had a lot of explaining to do, and I wasn't sure how I was going to go about it. But I had the chance to finally rest, and I wasn't about to say no to it. Not long after, a male nurse entered my room with a tray of food and smiled under his mask. "Hello, miss. I was told you were awake. You were in quite the condition when we got to you. It was a stroke of luck your neighbor saw you before you lost too much blood." "Blood? What happened to me?" I recalled the black marks again and ran my hand over the bandages on my neck. "You had some really deep wounds where the bandages are, and the neighbor's son saw you passed out on the driveway, bleeding." "Poor kid, but he saved your life," the male nurse responded. "Is Marcus here? Can I see him? He was with me." The nurse looked at me confused and scratched his head. "Ma'am, there was no one with you, and we don't have a patient by that name in the ward." I raised my eyebrow and felt myself begin to tense. "That's impossible. He was with me. Check again, please. I was with two other people, that lady and Marcus. Please, just check again." "Okay, ma'am, okay. Just don't stress yourself out, please. You really need to rest and keep yourself steady. I'll be back in just a few moments." He smiled and nodded at me before turning around and leaving the room. But I was too nervous for pleasantries right now. I started to wonder why Dr. Wilson was in such a rush, and why she'd lie about Marcus if he wasn't here. I'd remembered by now how she suddenly went missing while I was still inside that place. But I thought that, just like how I'd returned to the real world after I killed the other me, the same thing must have happened to her. But there wasn't another her, right? That's when I replayed our conversation over a few times in my head before she left, and I kept stopping at one detail in particular. Was I misremembering it, or did she get the name of her dog wrong? Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.